virtual conference and the 4th annual CyberNextDC conference. This one's hosted by the Cybersecurity Coalition and the Cyber Threat Alliance. 2020 has really been a year of silver linings, and we certainly have that with this conference today. We have, usually we do this in a conference room that holds up to 150 or 200 people, and we fill that up. Today we have 800 registrants, something that we would not be able to do if we were not doing it all virtually. We have a lot more international participants than we usually do. So we're taking the positives of this and doing the best we can in the current situation. And I think we have a great program lined up for you. I'm really excited about it. And I know that the folks at the Cyber Threat Alliance are as well. I'm Ari Schwartz. I am the coordinator of the Cybersecurity Coalition, and I'm managing director of cybersecurity services for Venable. And it's really my pleasure to be here today. I'm supposed to tell you that the hashtag for those that are tweeting is CyberNextDC 2020. There are a few hashtags that I'm floating around, but again, the official CyberNextDC 2020 hashtag is CyberNextDC 2020. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Cybersecurity Coalition. For those that don't know us, to give you a little bit of background, we are the leading policy coalition of cybersecurity companies. We've grown to 16 members this year, and that includes pure play cybersecurity companies and tech companies that have cybersecurity products and services. And despite the challenges in 2020, this year's really been a productive year for us. We have one of our main focuses has always been on vulnerability disclosure plans, and 2020 was a big year for increasing the number of vulnerability disclosure plans and including new requirements for federal agencies in the US and around the world for voluntary, for building vulnerability disclosure plans. We've also seen implementation of, the beginning of implementation of the USMCA cybersecurity risk management section, both in the US, in Canada, and Mexico. A lot of discussions about how that's going to work. It's something that the Cybersecurity Coalition helped to promote and helped to get through the finish line when it came around. Doing a lot more on privacy in the space, we continue to see a lot more issues in 2021 becoming really that we expect to start really moving forward. We're expecting with the new leadership team in government to see a lot more of the cybersecurity risk management efforts that we've been promoting move forward. And we hope to work with that new team hand in hand. It's my pleasure to kick off the conference by introducing Chairwoman Lauren Underwood. Representative Underwood joined Congress in 2019. Oh, there she is. Hello. She, at that point, she was the youngest African-American woman ever elected to Congress. Since that time has proven herself as a real leader on a wide range of issues, including healthcare and education and cybersecurity. And she is the new chairwoman of the House Homeland Security Committee's Cybersecurity Subcommittee. And so I think it's been about a month now that she's been the chairwoman, and we really look forward to having her join and engage on these wide range of issues, and really feel honored that this is one of the first places that she's spoken directly about cybersecurity. So we get the kind of the first a view of her agenda for the coming year. And I also like to congratulate you, Congresswoman, on your victory, because I know that it was a tough race, and I know that you fought really hard for that. And we're happy to have you coming forward and being the chairwoman for the future. Thank you very much for joining us.
I appreciate it. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I want to thank you for inviting me to participate in today's important discussion about cybersecurity policies for the 117th Congress and how we can work together to better secure and defend the internet ecosystem. When I came to Congress in 2019, I made defending our elections from foreign interference one of my top priorities. As we all know, a huge component of that is cybersecurity. In 2016, Russian hackers infiltrated the voter registration database of my state of Illinois, capturing personal data of 76,000 voters. Over the course of the 116th Congress, I've hosted a field hearing in Gurnee, Illinois, to assess the federal government's coordination with its state and local partners to defend election infrastructure, held an online forum to understand the tactics of foreign influence campaigns, and worked with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency to make sure it was doing its part to secure the 2020 elections. Last week, CISA issued a statement describing the November elections as the most secure in our nation's history, emphasizing that there was, quote, no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or was in any way compromised, end quote. My colleagues and I in the House have fought to send more federal support to state and local election officials. This support is urgently needed to replace outdated, insecure voting equipment, to improve the security of voter registration databases and e-poll books, and to implement risk-limiting audits, among other things. But our efforts this summer were blocked in the Senate. The 2020 election may be over, but the need for resources remains. I'm committed to working with my colleagues in the next Congress to make sure that our elections are even more secure in 2022 and 2024. Strong leadership at CISA and a clear mandate from the White House to secure elections will be a critical component to that effort. I'm confident that the Biden administration will prioritize election security. That said, I am disturbed by articles this past week reporting rumors that the current administration might punish CISA leadership for their good work on election security. Continuity of leadership and a smooth transition at CISA are critical to ensuring confidence in the 2020 election results and the success of other cybersecurity priorities moving forward. In addition to addressing ongoing election security issues, there are three other top cybersecurity priorities I look forward to addressing in the 117th Congress. One is identifying systemic approaches to improving the security of the internet ecosystem. Two, improving how we prevent and respond to ransomware attacks. And three, increasing CISA's ability to scale up support for targeted entities while maintaining planned operations. As some of you know, my background's in public health. When we tackle public health challenges, we know it's neither fair nor effective to put the whole burden on individuals to solve a systemic problem. Instead, we have to identify systemic approaches that address problems on a broader scale for maximum impact. Now, there's a famous story in our public health field about the origin of epidemiology. It takes place in 1854 during a major cholera outbreak in London. A doctor named John Snow had figured out that cholera was caused by contaminated water, and he had traced a cluster of deaths during the 1854 outbreak to a single water pump located on Broad Street. Instead of going around the neighborhood, knocking on doors, trying to individually persuade each resident not to drink from that pump, Dr. Snow went to the local authorities and persuaded them to remove the handle from the Broad Street pump so that no more contaminated water could be drawn from it. The story of the Broad Street pump exemplifies the way we approach many public health challenges to this day. As chairwoman of the Cybersecurity, Infrastructure Protection, and Innovation Subcommittee, I'm interested in finding where the pump handles are, so to speak. We are dealing with a suite of systemic weaknesses in the field of cybersecurity. Solving those weaknesses means lawmakers like me need to work closely with the experts in this room. I know there are ways that we can work together to take a Broad Street pump approach to the cybersecurity challenges facing our nation. To that end, I think the Cyberspace Solarium Commission makes a number of important recommendations that are worthy of further discussion and analysis. and I look forward to hearing the thoughts and suggestions of the people participating today. I've also focused on addressing the ongoing challenges posed by the increase in ransomware attacks. It is not realistic to tell state and local governments, hospitals, or small businesses to simply not pay a ransom demand. Instead, we must empower potential ransomware victims with options and weaken their attackers. That means helping state and local governments and critical infrastructure owners and operators improve their cybersecurity posture, build resiliency into their operations, and provide resources to help victims rebuild affected networks. I believe CISA can take on many of those challenges if Congress provides the right authorities and resources. Finally, I hope to put CISA in a position to dynamically respond to emerging threats without interrupting its day-to-day operations. In 2017, state and local officials flooded CISA with requests for risk and vulnerability assessments, RVAs, creating a 9-month-long waiting list. Under pressure from Congress, the waiting list for the RVAs seemed to disappear. We later learned that CISA had postponed RVAs for federal networks to meet the needs of state and local election officials. Similarly, CISA delayed deployment of continuous diagnostic and mitigation tools to certain federal networks in order to expedite deployment to the Department of Health and Human Services as COVID-19 pandemic hit the United States. Although I understand CISA's challenges in working within the limits of its budget, I'm concerned that constantly being forced to shift resources to address the latest threat creates an unsustainable game of whack-a-mole that leaves our networks vulnerable. We must identify an approach that provides CISA with the flexibility to scale up resources to address emerging threats while continuing its day-to-day operations. I'm excited to work with all of you on these and other cybersecurity challenges facing our nation. With that, looking forward to today's conversation, and thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a great overview of the things you're looking to do. Let me just tell people that they can use the Q&A button on the bottom to ask questions. So people should feel free to do that. And then I'll take the prerogative of asking a first question here, which is, I want to follow up on your comments on ransomware, because I know that it's a huge growing issue, obviously, for local government, state government, for hospitals, for schools, especially at this time when people are working remotely, et cetera. So, but one thing you talked about empowering them to act in this space and getting money, resources for them. How do you see us going about doing that, and what will you do to help have the committee move in that direction?
Yep, what a timely question. So over the past 2 years, we've seen ransomware attacks against some of our largest cities, right? Like Baltimore and Atlanta. And we've seen them cripple government services and cost taxpayers millions of dollars. Obviously, if even big cities are being victimized, smaller municipalities with fewer resources are especially vulnerable. My constituents in the Illinois 14th district know this too well, since one of our school districts was even hit by a ransomware attack last year. As I mentioned, we have to do more than simply tell people not to pay the ransom. We have to provide education, we have to provide resources, and give folks options. First, we have to communicate to our state and local partners about the potential problems associated with paying off a ransom demand, that they might not get their data back, that their data could still be sold or shared, the hacker could still be in the network, and the hacker may be subject to sanctions. Second, we have to help state and local partners better secure their networks. So this past fall, the House passed HR 5823, which is the State and Local Government Cybersecurity Act, which would establish a $400 million grant program at DHS to help state and local governments improve their cybersecurity posture. Senate action on that bill would be a huge step forward in our ability to fight against ransomware. And finally, we have to consider providing resources to build those who have been impacted by ransomware attacks to help them rebuild their networks more securely. And so I think it's best to prevent ransomware attacks by helping these state and local governments build better defenses. Even the best defenses can be overcome, right? And so we need to be better prepared for that instead of just leaving victims to fend for themselves.
Thank you. We have a question from Kent Lanfield from McAfee, who asked about the politicization of the CISA and what we can do to on the director job. I know that you have in the NDAA, the House passed language related to that. Are you supportive of that language, and how do we move that forward to depoliticize this CISA directorship?
Yep. So there's no room for politics in CISA's mission of defending our most critical networks. And in the last worldwide threat assessment, it warned that our adversaries were going to use cyber capabilities to undermine the United States and advance their own agendas. We know that these adversaries have used cyber tools to steal intellectual property and personal data, to engage in espionage, and execute destructive and expensive attacks. So to that end, I was really disturbed by rumors last week that Director Krebs might be forced out because of CISA's election security work. CISA's leadership should be commended for their quick work building a strong election security partnerships. And as far as the NDAA language, the National Defense Authorization Act, establishing a 5-year term for the CISA director, it's my understanding that there were objections in the Senate. And so we're going to reassess that legislation in the next Congress.
Thanks. The next question is from Christian Judge, who asks, many countries have a national call center paid for by the government for individuals and small businesses to call when impacted by cyber threats. Do you see that happening in the US at any point?
You know, Christian, I think that's an interesting question. I think that at least in terms of the scope of our work, we know that CISA operates a series of these ISACs, like the industry-specific councils that have pretty broad scope, and would encourage folks that are connected with organizations in this broadly defined critical infrastructure space to get connected with one of those groups. I would say the other option for folks, if on the criminality side, is to make sure that if they are a victim of an attack, to be in touch with the FBI. And I know that in maybe a lay audience, it might seem like kind of ridiculous to say that, but you all are a very discerning group and you know exactly what I mean. So I would not hesitate to reach out if you find yourself on the receiving end of an attack.
Thanks. Here's a semi-anonymous question asking about the ability to hack voting machines, and whether the proprietary nature of a lot of the voting machines and the way that the voting machine companies have responded to that. There's a question about whether we can make more of the move more voting machines to open source so that they can be audited by researchers and tested and made more secure. I don't know if you've looked into that or not, or if you have thoughts on that.
Oh, yeah. So, we do know that there is a lot of room for improvement with the actual voting machines. We know that some states are still using outdated election equipment that can't be patched. And we know that risk limiting audits haven't been universally adopted, and disinformation campaigns continue to obviously undermine confidence in elections. And so, I have been a real champion of increased funding, ongoing funding, predictable funding for state and local officials, the election officials, so that they can replace this outdated technology, train staff, and implement these risk limiting audits. It's so important. And I think that, quite frankly, what happened in this Congress with our repeated efforts over and over and over to pass legislation to secure our elections, including these types of hardware improvements, giving states and local officials money to do this work, and to have, Mitch McConnell either deny or only, be willing to appropriate 10% of the dollars that the House passed, is just unacceptable. And so, we've got to be at a place where election security is not received or viewed in a partisan lens. Our state and local officials are trying to stretch every dollar and they can't do it. And so while, yes, there's a lot of opportunity in the technology space in order to improve the hardware, if those devices can't get into the communities, right, because the state and local election officials cannot afford to purchase them, then we are not going to be in good shape as a country. And so right now, I think we have a real kind of political problem that we all need to continue to work through in order to make sure that these resources are getting into the communities we serve.
So I have two questions on ransomware that are semi-related. So one is from Carl Landwehr, one's from Richard Harrison, and they ask, what your plans are for addressing it more broadly. We talked a little bit about state and local governments and getting funds to them, but more broadly on stopping ransomware. And then specifically, Carl asked about product liability and whether the product liability for products that have been attacked, that have vulnerabilities that have been attacked, if you've looked into that issue at all.
Yep, not looked into the liability piece. If you all have specific thoughts, I would encourage you to reach out to our subcommittee, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection Innovation Subcommittee, the Committee on Homeland Security. Would love your input there. I'm not, to be candid with you, sure that we have jurisdiction over that liability piece, because CISA wouldn't have jurisdiction over that liability piece. But happy to receive your feedback and to work with my colleagues. In terms of broader ransomware threats, obviously I'm very concerned with what's going on in the healthcare sector. Even in the last several weeks, we've seen a dramatic uptake in the number of attacks on our healthcare sector because the healthcare providers are these tempting targets for hospital administrators. They're trying to decide whether to pay a ransom, and the stakes for that hospital system administration could be life or death for a patient. And so, we have to be proactive in addressing these vulnerabilities. It's about prevention. And so CISA, in my opinion, has a really important but underutilized role to play because we have to make sure that healthcare providers, especially those smaller providers with fewer resources, even know about CISA's free resources like cybersecurity assessments and penetration testing. And then we need these healthcare organizations to enroll in the coordinating bodies like the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council and the Health ISAC. And if for some reason we have some healthcare folks on this call, please contact your local protective security advisor, the PSAs. They are in your region to serve you, to see what CISA has to offer, and to join that health ISAC if possible, to get plugged in with the federal resources and partnerships that can help you stay prepared. And then there's these interagency processes and coordination between CISA, the FBI, Health and Human Services, and sector coordinating bodies. And that, interagency relationship mirrors for the other critical infrastructure sectors. So I'm just talking about healthcare as an example here. When we have more positive interagency coordination, we've seen how much more seamlessly information can flow and how helpful it is for end users, right? Like the partners in the community. And so I'm hoping that kind of broad interagency partnership will improve under the Biden administration.
Yeah, that's great. That'd be great. A big shout out to the Health ISAC, to Denise Anderson, who runs it. She's spoken at this conference before, and they do great work. So it is good to call them out. One final question. This is from a reporter from your inbox who asked about, you had mentioned about systemic approaches. She wants to know what you think the private sector's role in building building a systemic approach to protecting cybersecurity is.
Well, private sector are key partners here. I mean, we at every turn are engaging, and even if you monitor what the way that the committee functions, we're engaging our private sector partners. We're getting information, learning about new vulnerabilities. And quite frankly, we're eager to hear from folks, even on this call, about what your ideas and priorities are moving forward, because you guys are the experts on these issues. And so when we think about the agenda moving forward, we need to hear from you. And so again, I want to encourage everyone who has feedback about these issues that I raised or some others, right? Because we know that this is a landscape that is changing very rapidly, to please reach out to our subcommittee. We have amazing staff. I'm excited for the work that we can do together, and our door is always open. So, I talked about this interagency coordination. We talked about state and local governments. We talked about, the role of the Congress and, the work we need to do with the Senate. But I don't want you to hear that we don't think that there's a role for private industry. Oh my goodness, we're counting on you guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate your time. I think you've shown us why you've been named the chair of this committee, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you. Take good care of yourselves, everybody, okay?
Thanks. So next, we have a panel focused on IoT and IoT certification. And moderating that panel is going to be Alex Spotting, my colleague from Venable, Alex Spotting. I'm going to pass things over to him now.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Ari, and good morning, good afternoon, in at least one case of our panelists, good night. So my name's Alex Spotting. I'll be moderating this panel on IoT security, and this has been a pretty active area for governments over the past 18 months, I think it's fair to say. And it's certainly been a topic on which the Cybersecurity Coalition has been actively engaged in helping to shape some of those proposals that have come out. Our hope for the discussion today is that beyond outlining what's been done by individual countries, we can start to draw out some themes, similarities, differences, and dare I say, outline what might be a path forward for a coordinated international approach to IoT security, which is critical not only to addressing the challenge itself, but particularly from a private sector perspective as we look at companies that operate across a number of markets. We've got a fantastic panel with which to do that. We've got Mr. Soon Chia Lim, who's Director of Cybersecurity Engineering Center at the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore. We have Kat Migas, who is manager of the Cybersecurity for IoT program at NIST within the US Department of Commerce. We have Andreas Matrakis, who's head of unit for data security and standardization at ENISA, which is the EU Cybersecurity Agency. And finally, we have Peter Stevens, who is head of Secure by Design at DCMS, which is the UK's Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, affectionately known as the Department of Fun by a number of folks. So we'll kick things off by giving each of the panelists a few minutes to provide some opening thoughts, and then move into a moderated Q&A for about 25 minutes or so, and then we will open things up for audience questions. So if, as folks are watching along, please do send in questions via the Q&A function. It's never too soon to get those in. I'll monitor them and pose the questions to the panelists. With all of that said, why don't we go in alphabetical order by last name, keep this very formal as we like them to be, and I will turn over to Mr. Soon Chia Lim to kick things off.
Hi, good morning all. In DC, and good afternoon and evening to the rest. I'm really excited actually to join in this CyberNext panel to share more about Singapore, our perspective, and what we are doing about IoT. So perhaps a little about Singapore in the context of the global digital revolution. Well, globally, over the decade, we are witnessing what is termed the great digital convergence, starting with the convergence of computer and digital technologies, and increasingly the fusions of information's operational and consumer technologies into what we term as Internet of Things. And as along with this, actually, we are seeing in Singapore, we actually have embarked on the next phase of our social and economic development with Smart Nation as our vision for the future. And Smart Nation is about transforming technology, about applying technology to solve real-world problems, and that will make a difference to people's life and across the whole of society. So here we are talking about creating opportunities, bridges communities, and offers a better quality of life that can be enjoyed by all. And as a Smart Nation, we aim to be a leading economy powered by digital innovations and a world-class city with a government that gives our citizens the best home possible and responds to their different and changing needs. And we are eagerly pursuing a spectrum of smart initiatives, as you can see on the slide earlier on. There are many smart ideas, and we are trying to become one smart nation. And along with this, we are seeing a surge in the proliferation of consumer IoT devices. And of course, we heard about the number of IoTs being predicted to reach 75 million by 2025. And in Singapore, with a good infrastructure and a home broadband penetration rate of more than 93%, we are actually witnessing a multifold increase in the number of IoT per household. And this is especially of concern as most of the IoT devices deployed are of little and or no security measures, given the nature of the emerging technology. Because of this concern and given its transboundary nature, we have been working to actually galvanize global communities to build a secure and trusted IoT ecosystem. And as part of this effort, we have just launched our cybersecurity labeling scheme in October during the Singapore International Cyber Week. Well, rather than I take you through what is our cybersecurity labeling scheme, perhaps let's sit back and watch a short video on the scheme. Dustin, please.
Singapore is embracing digitalization and is advancing towards it with Smart Nation as the vision for our future. Over the years, Internet of Things devices have seen an exponential growth and global proliferation. But generally, IoTs have poor security, presenting themselves as easy targets for cyber criminals to take control of the device, compromise data security and privacy, and launch cyber attacks just like the Mirai botnet attack that left key global Internet services inaccessible for hours. To improve IoT security and raise overall cyber hygiene levels, the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore has launched the Cybersecurity Labeling Scheme. The CLS is the first scheme in Asia Pacific that seeks to provide greater transparency in the security of IoT devices using a 4-level rating label. The label allows consumers to discern the level of security offered by the product and imbues security consciousness when making purchases. The label can help manufacturers differentiate their products in the market and incentivize them to develop more secure products while reducing the cost of compliance across nations through mutual recognition. The Cybersecurity Labeling Scheme has 4 progressive rating levels. Level 1, meeting basic security requirements. Level 2, adherence to the principles of security by design. Level 3, absence of known common software vulnerabilities. And Level 4, resistance against common cyber attacks. With CLS, we aim to raise cybersecurity hygiene, incentivize developers to produce more secure products, and build a more trusted and secure cyberspace for everyone.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that introduction, Sujia. And I think we'll turn things over now to Kat to give us a couple of minutes overview of the US perspective on this. Kat, I don't think we can hear you at the moment.
Mute would help. Can you hear me
There we
now?
go. Perfect.
Yeah. Okay, great. I will get this one day before we all return to working in the office full time. So before jumping into, giving a little bit of background on the program, I'm with NIST. For those of you who may not be familiar, we are the Institute of Standards and Technology in the Department of Commerce. We are non-regulatory. Our work is rooted in working very closely with stakeholders and developing guidance that's voluntary. I work for the IT laboratories, and within IT laboratories, our stated purpose is to cultivate trust in IT. And that's a lot of the background and purpose and catalyzation for a lot of our work in IoT. I do want to mention when it comes to FISMA and federal agencies, we do have a role there around cybersecurity and providing guidance to federal agencies that through the FISMA Act, as well as an OMB memo, is a requirement for federal agencies. But outside of that work, we work very closely with industry, and we take great pride in our work being adopted and voluntary. So we stood up the program about 4 years ago at NIST, and we started out by first listening to stakeholders. What should we be doing that we are not doing, and what can we do to help? And the resounding feedback was, there's so much good guidance already. Can we build on what's out there already? And can we view this as an evolution rather than a revolution and throw everything out? So what we did is we started by looking at things like the cybersecurity framework, the NIST RMS, and we looked at areas that we'd had a lot of success in NIST, and we rooted our principles that until today we feel those principles hold valid. One, anything we do needs to be risk-based and must be developed with risk in view. The other is, our work is always outcome-based. We feel that to be meaningful and to be able to keep up with the adoption and rapid pace of technology, we really need to stay at the outcome-based level. We recognize one size doesn't fit all, and we also recognize it's an ecosystem of things. And while there is a lot of talk about devices and the security of devices, these devices don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in an environment and an ecosystem, and there's a role in all of the ecosystem for security of the Internet of Things. So to fast forward, how we ended up to where we are today, we started out by looking at the cybersecurity framework and the RMS and identified areas where IoT was potentially different and would actually introduce different risks and have to be addressed differently. And we published that in NIST IR 8228 as a guide for organizations that are using the cybersecurity framework or the RMS to understand where they should be focusing on and perhaps changing the way they mitigate their risks. And the takeaway was that in some areas, while there's a clear shared responsibility across the ecosystem for security, there were some areas where the manufacturers of IoT devices could benefit from understanding what was the expectations of some of these organizations or customers of these IoT devices, and helping clarify where is the organization potentially dependent on something that the IoT device manufacturer offers. And this is how we went down this path of identifying a core baseline. We call it the IoT cybersecurity core baseline. Wanting to start first by looking broad. We listened to stakeholders. One of the key concerns of our stakeholders was, can we try to avoid, where possible, fragmentation? As an IoT device manufacturer, I serve many markets, both domestic as well as international. How can we mitigate this concept of having differing requirements across all my different markets? So we started by saying, okay, where's a core baseline? Where can we all somewhat agree? These are in our case the 6 key elements that we think any IoT device should be able to support. We started out by looking broad. We looked domestic, we looked international, and we worked over a year with stakeholders. We had 2 public comment periods. We incorporated 600 public comments into what is now known as NIST IR 8259. which is our core baseline. And that was published earlier this year in June. And, trying to eat our own dog food now, we are starting out with that core baseline, and we are adapting that to the federal government. So that's our current work. We have a program website. We have lots of upcoming work as well on confidence mechanisms. I'm sure we'll talk about it through today's panel. So thank you, Alex.
Brilliant. I'm seeing, thanks for that, Kat. And I'm seeing Andreas is on, but I don't see his webcam. Andreas, are you able to hear us? There we go.
Yes, I am. Thank you. Thank you, Alexander. I'm going to share my screen for a moment. I suppose, actually, I'm not supposed to do that. All right. Sorry about that. I have a bunch of slides. I could share them if it were to be possible. Anyway,
it was just enabled, so you should be able to share.
Is
now.
it? Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. So here we go.
The wonders of technology.
Who would ever have thought of that? All right. Could you actually see my screen now, or am I sharing?
You're not, no. So
No.
if you hit share screen and then click your screen and then hit the blue share button in the bottom right corner.
Yeah,
there you
one
go.
more. All right, I just had one more click to make. So here I am. So good afternoon, everyone. It's evening over here in Athens, East European time zone. My name is Andreas Mitrakis. I work for the EU Cybersecurity Agency, known by the acronym ENISA. The acronym does not represent the current keywords of the agency on the agency's name. I have just a small set of slides for you, just to highlight some of the assertions of the key instruments we have at our disposal in order to carry out policy support work in the EU. This instrument is called the EU Cybersecurity Act. It was adopted in June. Actually, it came into effect in June last year. So it's been in force for approximately a year and a half. And a lot has gone under the bridge since then. A lot has happened in terms of activities. Now, a key point here is to highlight that this legal instrument foresees a framework for cybersecurity certification in the EU. So this is a legislative instrument. So the European Commission and all the member states can ask ENISA to draft cybersecurity certification scheme on policy areas of their interests. ENISA, working with experts and under close collaboration with member states representatives, it produces a scheme which, provided it is adopted, becomes part of European law. So for a small stakeholders-oriented agency that did not quite have much to regulate for about 15 years, this is important business. Of course, ENISA gets to do all sorts of policy support tasks and assist in different governance functions, but this is not quite so important for our discussion. Importantly, we're looking into working very closely with the European standards organizations and the international standardization development organizations, ISO, IEC, ETSI, and Sensenelec in Europe, in order to bring forward the best of all, the latest of what happens at the standardization level, and make sure that security provisions and requirements for the purpose of conformity assessments are duly reflected and represented in the schemes that ENISA proposes. So here, what we had in mind is also to take into account complementarity across the different areas. It is, I think, fair to say that in the past almost 30 years, the example area, the paradigm has been set through the work around the Common Criteria Mutual Recognition Agreement. In Europe, it has been known as the SOG-IS, under the SOG-IS acronym, which essentially was an intergovernmental agreement across some European countries, but it never came under the EU treaty, so it was never part of EU law as such. Until, of course, the advent of the Cybersecurity Act. So currently, ENISA is transitioning the common criteria scheme under, and just bringing it gradually under the EU treaty in the context of this act that we're talking about. And in parallel, we're also looking into cloud services, processing a request received for cybersecurity certification there. Of course, we are looking into an area where one can imagine that a device is certified under the common criteria requirements in the EU would also be used to a certain extent for cloud services that would also be based on EU provisions thereupon. So we're looking into a system, and gradually we'll move into verticals and other areas, including IoT for different purposes, as I can explain after the presentation further. So a lot of interesting activities, as you can imagine, lots of lines to draw and links to process. Now, with the two concentric circles here, what I want to say is that we have a full life cycle approach based on a union rolling work program, which feeds into, which lays out the provisions, what schemes Europe needs. That feeds into ENISA work, which is crystallized through the input of working group, ad hoc working groups, as they mentioned. Thereafter, provided there is member state voting in committee, these schemes become the law, EU law. And then we enter into 5-year maintenance phases, which are recurrent for each scheme. In ENISA, we wanted to, since of course we believe that we could even be smarter than the legislator, who could have ever thought of that, we thought that we can enhance this whole approach by proposing a risk-based methodology for the purpose of determining assurance level. So assuming you're a vendor of a semiconductor product, for instance, by following a specific risk-based methodology that I will propose, then such vendor could determine the level of assurance that she needs to assign to a specific product, depending on the application, on the number of parameters, including the application environment, usages, and common risks, and this sort of thing. We also develop guidance, and we'll go to great lengths to provide guidance to conformity assessment bodies, vendors, manufacturers, consultants, public authorities, all our stakeholders in the different areas concerning each individual scheme. And of course, you can imagine that we have a very motivated team to help on that. Last slide, just wanted to bring to fore the relationship with the standards organization that I referred to before. We are also looking into stretching beyond the limits of collaboration with public interest standards organizations, and also include the private slash industry standardization to our bigger picture. So we're coming up with a strategy there too, but the message remains the same, that we're looking to standards with a critical eye, trying to identify gaps. Sometimes our stakeholders are kind enough to share such gaps with us, and we could convey that message further to the standards organization, or look into new areas where standardization is likely to be needed. So thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the QA session, Alexander. Thank you.
Likewise. Thanks so much for that, Andreas. And we'll turn things over to Peter for a few minutes of remarks before we get into the Q&A. Peter.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you I won't take up much of everyone's time. It's great to hear all the progress that's been taken around the world as well. So I won't have as much to say because there's already so many wonderful things happening. First thing, so my name is Peter Stevens, and it's my pleasure to lead the Secure by Design team. Fundamentally, my team exists to protect citizens, networks, and infrastructure from the range of harms that can come from compromised consumer connected devices. So that includes the IoT. And it's something that we take really seriously, and we've worked in partnership with the NCSC as well as with industry, academics, and people on the school, and people I'm sure in the panel, in the attending as well, who have been really helpful to us in terms of how can we try and take the steps we need to protect people. I think we fundamentally know that these devices are great and offer real health benefits. They can keep people connected, which I think is more important now than ever. And help reduce carbon footprints as well. And I think that fundamentally we do want to see this category of devices work. We want to see it succeed, and we think that consumer trust, as Kat mentioned before, is a really integral part of that. Sadly, we know right now that the poor practice is really letting the side down, and there's a lot of potential possibilities which can happen and can arise, and harms that can arise from these devices once compromised. Mirai is in a not too distant past, and also we know that there are other instances of other damage that can happen at individuals level or even at networks. So what we've done is we have worked in partnership with the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, and we have helped to try and codify what good practice looks like, seeking to try and support industry across a range of scales to implement good practice and make that publicly available. So we published that in 2018. As well as that, we've been really working with international standards bodies to try and develop standards that can help us to deliver on the feedback from those 13 outcome-led principles in the code of practice, which we're working closely with ETSI, and most notably on the development of ETSI TS 103645 and also EN 303645. As well as also engaging with other international standards fora as well, who have been really important for us to kind of gather feedback from industry and academics on our approach. And also just in parallel, we've also been thinking since we started this work, and given the industry response of it's all very well publishing codes of practice, but in order to do that, there was a need for regulatory teeth and a need for us to recognize our role in how can we not only socialize good practice, but also be prepared to set the most appropriate and pragmatic baseline for this broad spectrum of devices, which we know come from small startups all the way up to trillion-dollar tech companies. And so I think that we really have been thinking about that. So in 2019, we had a consultation on what could be the possibility of a regulatory approach, and we've continued that work over in 2020 as well. In 2020, this year, in June, July, we published a call for views on our proposed regulatory approach as well. So right now we're reviewing a lot of the feedback from that, and I see our approach in the future to be to try and think how quickly we can develop a regulatory approach that is appropriate and pragmatic, which gets the right balance in making sure that we make sure that appropriate information is transparent at the point at which these devices are purchased, without doing so in a way which will place a heavy burden so as to reduce the innovation and reduce the these exciting products, many of which already do embed good security. So fundamentally, I see my team as having two core ambitions. The first is to really socialize good practice and support all organizations to adopt it. I think that we've worked in closely with ETSI, as I've mentioned before, and it's really exciting to see the work that's going on in Singapore with their voluntary labeling scheme in particular. And I think also another area that we're working towards is how can we engage with industry associations and academics to gather feedback on our approach. We have also developed some training and made available for manufacturers and retailers of these devices to try and support them around what it means to embed good security practices, and also seeking to develop that low burden approach. Something that we've also done is support the development of assurance schemes, recognizing that above the baseline, we want to be able to support all organizations to always make their products as secure as they can be. So we have this year also supported the development of assurance schemes in the UK as well. And our second big approach is to deliver legislation as soon as possible. So this is something that I'm sure we can talk about in the coming questions. And yeah, lovely to meet you all, and I hope everyone is safe and well. Thanks so much.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for the opening remarks, folks. Let's hop on into the conversation, the Q&A portion of the conversation. First question that we had sort of discussed, and using this as a bit of a level set for talking through the difference in approaches. Peter then mentioned socializing good practices and driving adoption as one of the core objectives of the UK government's approach. I wonder if we can level set on what is the fundamental, excuse me, what is the fundamental challenge that governments are trying to address here? Is there a common challenge that everybody is working towards? I'll throw that over to Andreas first.
Alex, thank you. Big fingers, clumsy use of flat surfaces. I suppose the problem, as it's presented to policymakers, is it's a substantial one. It's of the size of 75 billion IoT devices by 2027, gazing upon us all, if we were to believe these gloomy forecasts. And now, of course, it's not so much about how many of those devices we'll have, or billions thereof, but what they will actually do. And there's an awful lot of things that they might. So I think it's quite fair that policymakers are concerned, and they're already taking up measures into responding to the challenge. Essentially, in the EU, I recall that back in March 2015, the European Commission ignited the Alliance for Internet of Things Innovation, trying to build an ecosystem around the concepts of IoT. They didn't stand still. Later on, they produced consecutive layers of policy guidance, including digitizing European industry initiative that was published in 2016. They looked into the ecosystem again, human-centered IoT approach, as you might expect in Europe, and single market, of course, because this is the key message of the European Union. As the most impactful policy area is the internal markets. So currently, we have moved to a situation that presents the internal market for data as the digital single market. That's the acronym to use, and it's a powerful notion because policy there looks into clearly the cross-border situation, interoperability at the applications level, liability issues, and it's seeking in general to master the complexity that inevitably emerges. Now, if we wanted to layer the problem, we could see that there's different policy initiatives directed towards, for instance, different layers thereof. So you have consumer protection sitting right at the heart of the EU response. And I recall that standard of ETSI EN 303-645 related to consumer IoT. That's a very new standard, approved by all standards organizations, the member states. So it reached a very high level very fast. Then there's activity around industrial systems, industrial control systems related to critical infrastructure and the implementation of the NIS directive. That's the Network Information Security Directive that looks into operators of critical services or essential services, critical infrastructure at large, just to keep it simpler. And there's provisions for security and evaluation that could be taken into account. I could also reflect on the possibility of using the policy strand of electronic identification for individuals as a way to make a more dense net of provisions in relation to IoT, so that people indeed know who owns or controls what. For all these areas, I might not have precise replies because policy formation is in the making as we speak. But good news is that come December, The Commission will publish policy guidance further in some of these areas. So we expect to hear something about the Union's rolling work program on certification, which might be impactful in this area for us. But also we might just get more input in relation to electronic identification and to IoTs as it stands. Thank you.
So, but the fundamental policy challenge, as I understand it, there's kind of two buckets in here. One is the question around individual devices and their, the capacity for harm by them being corrupted. And then there's the broader ecosystem challenge of, even if the individual device itself not acting as it should doesn't impact the thing it should be controlling, it can impact other devices. And when we do that across, as you say, a universe of billions of devices, then that creates problems elsewhere in the system. When we look at those two problems, what sort of behavior are we hoping to see here from the various stakeholders, the manufacturers, the retailers, the users of devices? Sunchia, I wonder if you could jump in on that one.
Great, thanks. Andre, you want to say something?
No, I misunderstood the question. Sorry about
that. Apologies.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So for our CLS or the cybersecurity labeling scheme, for example, actually we designed it upfront actually to cover not just the user or the retailers or the manufacturers, but also among the international partners. So let me explain these few entities, and we call it the approach of C, D, and E. So for C, for consumers, when you said it, the user, currently the cybersecurity provisions of IoT devices is pretty opaque for most. And the CLS actually aims to make such provisions transparent to the user by creating these 4 levels of cybersecurity. We hope to actually, and through that, we hope to make the cybersecurity provisions transparent and visible to the user, and in the process, educate and create the awareness, enhance the awareness of the cybersecurity risk in them, and we hope to change the consumer mindset and imbue in them a cybersecurity consciousness. So that actually to help them make informed choices when they make purchases of such IoT devices. And we have D, which is developers, and we classify these all in the basket, the manufacturers, retailers, all in the same basket. And we hope that through the changing attitude of the consumer, we hope that this will in turn incentivize the developers to develop more secure products. And with a cybersecurity labeling scheme, it will help the developers to differentiate their product from competition and attain a quality branding. And E, we call it for economy and ecosystem. And essentially, we want to garner like-minded partners to actually adopt and for mutual recognitions of such labeling scheme and standards, so to reduce duplicate testing, reduce the cost of compliance, and improve market access across the border, so as to actually grow the digital economy. So that's the kind of behaviors that actually we try to hope to achieve in not just the manufacturing retailers and user, but also actually to seek mutual recognitions among like-minded countries, so as to galvanize global communities to actually build a safe and a trusted IoT ecosystem.
Anything else folks wanted to add to that? Peter, Kat, Andreas? Or does that pretty well cover it?
I think from my side, the most what I would love to see more of is, I think fundamentally it's about normalizing the transparent sharing of information between the manufacturer, the retailer, and the consumer. And I think that I definitely agree with Sue about the idea about how can we make consumers aware of, so when they go and they make informed decisions. I think fundamentally consumers do value the security of their devices. I think the challenge that we've often found is that they overwhelmingly assume they already are safe simply because they're for sale. And I think that a challenge for us as policymakers is to try and help, select the appropriate, canaries of what are the right and appropriate measures through which they can use to differentiate appropriate levels of security that meet whatever product they're choosing to buy. So for me, it comes down to the importance of transparency.
Hey, Alex?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Kat. So we see it as, we've been working primarily lately looking at the industrial market, and I think this topic of transparency and choice may be different depending on whether you're looking at the consumer market or depending on whether you're looking at the industrial market. I think the mechanisms may be slightly different. We had a workshop on cybersecurity risk of consumer devices about 3-4 weeks ago. At this point, we'll be publishing the results of the workshop. But there was a lot of discussion around, and I'd be curious if there's been studies that have been done around how much can your average home consumer make the assessment and kind of understand what is the appropriate level of risk? How do I decide what is the appropriate level of security for a device given in that market? Whereas when you look at the industrial organizations' use of IoT devices, they have more resources available to them. They have the ability to apply more complex frameworks. So I think there's validity in talking about transparency as being key, and we're looking at areas such as SBOMs and how can we automate some of that process to provide that transparency. But when it comes to the consumer, I think that is an area that we are still looking to do additional research on in this. Thanks.
Yeah. I'd sort of add to that. I think it's a really important distinction to make, obviously, the sort of industrial use case versus the consumer use case. And I think certainly in the context of Singapore and the UK, what we're talking about is on the consumer side. There doesn't seem to be strong evidence that labeling is effective outside of the minds of those of us who are imagining these things up. It certainly seems intuitive. You reduce information asymmetry, provide information to a consumer. Nobody wants to be the result of a cybersecurity incident, so therefore they will respond to that behavior. In reality, I don't know that that's true in practice. Certainly, I know there have been studies that say it may not be true. I'm sure there are others out there that say that it is a valid hypothesis. We've also got issues around labeling saturation. You've got your Energy Star label, you've got your cybersecurity label, all these other things. How many of these is the consumer really going to invest time in looking at? When you get to online purchasing, to what extent does the consumer look beyond the first picture on there? They're probably looking at other things like online reviews, not certifications, and so on. Anyway, all of that to say, I wonder if we can transition into this discussion a bit more and hear from folks in the UK or Singapore. Why was labeling your preferred choice, and what information do you have to sort of support its utility? Maybe Peter, if we kick off with you.
So in terms of the approach of labeling, so labeling was a proposed option that we shared in our 2019 consultation. I think that we recognise that there's always going to be a challenge about all the things you just mentioned, Alex, about how can we make sure that consumers are responding appropriately to the information presented in the label, and how can we make sure that also the additional requirements on industry to develop the label is worth it for the the additional security benefit that we get to consumers. And I suppose the feedback from our 2019 consultation showed that actually, rather than having a label with a tick to say that it met the sort of the baseline security requirements that we called out, which we should just be mandating the 3 outright. So what we kind of came to end up in terms of an approach, which I think about pragmatically, if we mandate the security requirements and we mandate that at the point of purchase, the manufacturer and the retailer have to be transparent with the consumer about the length of time for which that product will receive security updates, we're getting many of the benefits of having a label, but we're then not going to mandate the mechanism through which they present that information, which we thought was helpful in terms of trying to find the sort of low burden approach. And I think that, again, this is definitely, we feel as though in an ideal world, I think it'd be awesome if organizations and manufacturers were starting to differentiate themselves with their security provisions and starting to sort of to use the length of time for which the device is supported for as a way to differentiate their product from their competitors. And I think that that's something that I would like to see more of, but that's how we ended up in terms of our relationship with the label. And I think, from our side, I'm very keen. I know that there's definite successes and definite benefit of having a label for particularly the manufacturers who already do the right thing. So I think there's definitely a bit of a balance that needs to be struck between the two. But sorry, Suna, over to you.
Yeah, so actually prior to introducing the cybersecurity labeling scheme, actually we conducted a consumer survey, and this gave us additional confidence before we push out this labeling scheme, because essentially the consumers are in a way already asking for it. Maybe let me highlight a few of the statistics that was collected. For example, in Singapore, there are 63% who actually preferred a device with a label over device without a label. And then there's 66% that actually find that it is important or very important actually to introduce a labeling scheme. And about 79% actually is willing to pay for a labeled device. In fact, this actually survey is actually quite similar to a more in-depth survey that was actually conducted in UK. But at the same time, I also like to perhaps highlight a few attributes that actually of our cybersecurity labeling scheme. First, actually, the scheme is not a static scheme. In fact, I mean, given that the threat landscape is dynamic and evolving and all that, and the baseline cannot afford actually to be static, and the labeling scheme allows kind of water to find its level, and for us to actually progressively actually nudge the market towards higher cybersecurity requirements based on the market interest, the acceptance and the readiness of the developer. So for different equipment, for example, I mean, they may have, for a start, they may have, they may gravitate towards different level of cybersecurity, and a different rate. So perhaps, light could be initially CLS level 1, and maybe for things that are more important, say routers, home routers, maybe CLS3. And over time, if they get saturated into level 4, then we can actually consider to zeroize and reset our requirement. And we see success in, say, the energy efficiency rating scheme in doing that. So we find that that's very useful. And actually, these also can be very very specific to the devices. As I mentioned, certain device may warrant to attract a higher level of a label, and while other devices which are maybe less critical have a lower level of CLS, they may be acceptable. So actually, this allows us to strike a delicate balance between raising the cybersecurity hygiene while actually continue to encourage innovation and the advent of new products.
Just one point of clarification there on the statistics that you cited at the beginning, the 63%, 66, 69%. That was survey data that wasn't then going in and tracking consumer behavior on the back end. Is that correct? So this was sort of asked.
Sorry, say that again.
So this was asking consumers the question in a survey format would you prefer something that had a label versus not, as opposed to tracking their behavior on whether it actually shifted consumer behavior? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, for a start, yes, correct. And I also like to highlight that our scheme is planned to be flexible. And if you notice that there are actually 4 levels, and it will be lightweight if you wish to, and it will be which is actually essentially a self-declaration system, which is referring to level 1 and 2, and it could be involving third-party independent assessment, and if that's what you sought, you know, that is in a way flexible, and because and in doing so, actually the scheme is also cost effective and consistent because of this flexibility. It allows the consumer, the user, and the manufacturers actually to choose the most cost-effective approach depending on the risk profile they are comfortable with, and yet it is consistent. It's consistent as well, given that at the higher levels, tier 3 and 4, actually it involves third-party independent evaluations with oversight from actually a certification body. So this allows consistency in terms of test cases that is bespoke to each categories of equipment. And as I mentioned earlier on, I mean, it's robust because actually we deal with comprehensively the consumer, developers, and also aiming at the mutual recognition.
Andreas, did you want to jump in there?
Just a reflection. In my mind, it indeed makes sense to work at the consumer level. You need the visa of cybersecurity for easy visual prompts and recognition. But best would be just to follow, as it was mentioned before, nutrition labels pattern. Meaning that it's not just the recognition of a determined level of or predetermined level of assurance, but also some key information that could be conveyed to the consumer in relation to the products they have in their hands. It might be interesting if you have unaware and informed categories of consumers that need to be protected, like minors, like silver surfers, all sorts of categories of people that are not all that involved with technology. Then there's a different set of requirements for industrial systems. They're indeed being able to dynamically determine the desired assurance level and take additional steps in order to meet industry, business, or regulatory requirements, I think would make good sense. So I think labeling there could work more closely with the needs of the public services, supervisory authorities and the like, or they could be as well as industry-led ones for the same purpose in order to convey such requirements to the stakeholder.
So I want to kind of push back on this piece before, in a second, we're going to transition over to the international piece and open up some of the audience questions because we're already up against time and we're probably going to run a few minutes over. But I do just want to drill down on that piece. Andreas mentioned nutrition labels. We've got a kind of different model with the Singaporean labels. We've got a different model with the UK labels. Do we have concrete evidence for each of these different proposals that it actually changes consumer behavior, or are we just assuming that because it works in the context of food or in the context of energy that suddenly consumer behavior is going to change in a cybersecurity context? That can be to anyone.
Well, that's something, of course, I think we will be monitoring very keenly. But perhaps I'd like just to add another aspect of the cybersecurity labeling scheme. That is actually, for a start, actually the scheme is voluntary. But actually, we are open to mandate the labeling scheme at a later stage. If we find it necessary to ensure that the consumer devices are labeled. In fact, this is already happening with actually home router, or we call it residential gateway. because of its criticality, and actually we are leveraging on existing legislative power. Actually, we have worked with our telecoms a regulatory body to actually to align their mandatory technical specifications with our cybersecurity labeling scheme at level 1. So in 12 months' time, that's almost like by this time next year, all home routers sold in Singapore must meet the level 1 requirements.
Why don't we transition over into the international focus and some of the questions that have come in, because that's been quite a common theme on the Q&A session. So by and large, we're looking at a common problem. I think largely I'm hearing a lot of commonality in terms of what we want to drive in terms of behavior from the various stakeholders. And yet we've got individual countries putting forward slightly tweaked proposals, and we've got efforts in ISO and ETSI, and it seems like this is an awful lot to be tracking if you're a small company producing, 1 or 2 widget digits that you want to be able to sell globally. So I wonder if folks can speak to a little bit of the work that's being done to drive an internationally coordinated approach on this topic, and maybe I can throw that over to Kat and then Peter to kick off.
Thanks, Alex. Well, I'm going to talk about international standards. I do think international standards is a good place for the conversation to start. I'm not sure that we can ever achieve complete harmonization, but I do think interoperability and using standards and international standards as a basis to base that interoperability on is a good place to start. Obviously as NIST, we do keep ongoing conversations, both bilateral and in other fora, trying to identify where we do have agreements. But what I do like about taking these conversations to an international standard space is it really allows all stakeholders to participate. We don't believe we have all the answers. That's why we engage so closely with the manufacturing community, because it's the manufacturers that will actually have to build the solutions. At the end of the day, they'll have to support them. They have to be realistic. Understanding the complexity of requiring a manufacturer to support a device or commit to secure updates. There's complexities that go beyond that, and so having everyone at the table and being able to discuss those in an open forum, we think is the best way forward. No.
I'm inclined to agree.
Yeah.
Peter.
Yeah, no, and I agree with Kat, and I think that there's definitely a role for the international standards bodies, and I think that I can only say that the feedback that we've been gathering from the forum that we've been establishing has always been incredibly helpful to our work in terms of translating the code into implementable provisions. I think that something that I'm always struck by is there are given the broad spectrum of devices or that we can talk about within the IoT and how you can cut it, and whether it's we talked about vertical or horizontal approaches. There is always going to be, and given how fast it's moving, there's always going to be slightly updated and slightly tweaked. And I think that there isn't an easy answer in the back of the book. And I think that we have to be quite clear about, we can put by putting forward options for people to say this is what good looks like, and to make sure that is benefiting from robust feedback. That is a helpful step. And then I think also it's important for us to focus on the, as opposed to the gray areas of where inevitably there is always going to be some sense of disagreement. To clarify, there's always a great deal more that unites than there is that divides them. And I think that there is a great deal of agreement. There's a great deal of consensus of what, pragmatic steps we can take in the first instance, so as to move from, fundamentally where you've got quite a lot of devices which have got quite critical vulnerabilities, which really they shouldn't have right now, because it's well known that they carry things like default passwords, which we just know and shouldn't really be there. And I think that, by focusing on that, we can kind of get the low-hanging fruit in the first instance. And then over time, to Soon's point about the importance of monitoring and evaluation to see how it's being taken up by industry, how is manufacturers starting to, are we content with the level of risk and how much we want to do we think that there is more of a need for us to kind of be adaptable in how we use our approach? And so I think that that's something that we have to do as an ongoing journey. But I think that definitely that we should focus on where there is agreement and consensus in the first instance. And I think there's a lot to go on there.
And if I may, I certainly want to echo what Peter is saying, that actually there are more similarity than differences. And I think we should work together to harmonize these approaches or scheme so that we have actually more mutual recognitions and we can work together moving ahead. And for example, for Singapore, I think right from the start, actually we intended to adopt the best standard that's out there. And I'd like to give credit to DCMS UK, Peter's side, actually for engaging us on the 13 COPs that they initiated, which is eventually evolves to become the ETSI, which is the European Telecommunication Standards Institute's baseline requirements for consumer IoT, which Andre mentioned earlier on, the EN 303645. So really, we have the same starting point. And of course, all of us, we are aiming for the same end outcome as well, essentially is to improve IoT hygiene and to build a secure and trusted IoT ecosystem. So really, I think all roads lead to Rome. And so I think there are really a lot of common grounds for us to work together to actually galvanize the effort and move towards a secure and trusted IoT ecosystem globally.
And Andreas, obviously the effort that you're undertaking is specifically directed at this international harmonization or alignment. I think, ETSI, the ETSI standard has clearly been internationalized in that it exists in that body, but has been used by countries outside of the European Union as well. Both Australia and Singapore are examples of that. Do you envision whatever Europe decides to do in this space will be taken to international standard setting bodies, or work will be done to ensure that kind of mutual recognition or alignment?
Well, it would be great, but probably that belongs to the level of poetry. First we take Manhattan, then we take Berlin. Probably at the consumer level, there will be a clear gap. So when the colleagues from the United Kingdom came up with the ETSI-led approach, they had something very concrete and clear in their minds. They were very correct. The timing was also maybe slightly delayed, but still not too much so. And I think that's why this standard worked out very fast and very much to the point, and it's very welcome. But when it comes down to industrial systems, I'm sorry, I have to be a killjoy there. We might just see that internal market priorities take precedence, and then public authorities might want to move into this area at different speeds. I think the motivation behind related to state interest, public interest, and so forth could be well explained. And I'm quite confident that along the lines of the model that the EU internal market has set, access to services and equipment will not be discriminated as it is. Essentially, what is at stake here is to have a significant amount of transparency and understanding of what happens with complex systems, rather than block, border, or lay up fences and layers of impediments to manufacturers and vendors and service providers. So there will be differences. If I could also say the magic word here, privacy and personal data protection, I would be even more of a killjoy, because then, of course, the European approach is quite strict, and we also have to live under the consequences of the recent Schrems II decision of the European Court of Justice that has conditioned yet further transatlantic personal data flows. But this is the complexity of the environment we have. As a lawyer, I'm very pleased that the amount of complexity is so high. What use would there be for lawyers if it weren't so?
Well, as someone who works within a law firm myself, I couldn't agree with you more on that front. But we are unfortunately at the end of our time. In fact, Ari was kind enough to let us run 10 minutes over our time. And I think there's an awful lot else that we could get into, but we will need to save that for another day. I did just want to echo that final point, because I know that our member companies who are sitting here today, it is of the utmost importance to them, and the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of SMEs that are integrated into those supply chains. This has the potential to be a huge technical barrier to trade issue if we don't get the coordination aspect of things right. But I know that you all know that, and want to thank you both for your time today, and for what's been a really great discussion, and also for the huge amount of work that I know you're all respectively putting into tackling this issue. So many thanks to you, and I'll turn things back to Ari.
Thanks. Thanks to you, Alex. Thanks to the panelists. I'm glad we went a little over. We got a Leonard Cohen quote in there that makes for a much better panel than any time, in my view. So I wanted to remind people that we're coming back. We're taking a half-hour break now. We'll come back at 1 o'clock Eastern time, and at that time we have the election security panel. It is set up to be a very, very good panel. And then following up on that one, we're actually going to have Ann Newberger from NSA speak about her outreach to the private sector, plans for outreach to the private sector moving forward. So I think we have a great afternoon lined up, and we look forward to seeing people back here in a half an hour. Thanks.
We're back to that type of beer.
Okay, we're going to get started back up here. Let's start on time. Hope everyone had a good lunch. We are passing things along, passing things off to our next panel on election security. Moderating that panel is Marshall Irwin, who's the Chief Security Officer for the Mozilla. Marshall?
Thank you, Ari. Thanks. So we've got a great panel today to talk about election security. I want to start off by thanking our panelists, both for participating, but also for all of the work that they have done and that all of the people they represent have done over the past few weeks and few years, actually, to make sure that we had a safe and secure election. In the context of so many concerns about the integrity of our electoral process and also how it would adapt to the pandemic, I think the success that we've seen over the past few weeks is really remarkable and laudable. And the panelists today, I think, deserve a lot of credit for that. So thank you wholeheartedly. So what I'm hoping we can do today is not just reflect on that success, but also think hard about what allowed for that success. What are the real factors that drove the outcomes that we saw? And then use this as at least an initial inflection point to think about what we should be doing in the future, or what we should continue to do to make sure that the next election that we have is also the most secure one that we've had in American history. So with that, I'll do some quick introduction for our panelists. So today we have Ben Hovland. Ben is the current chairman of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. He has worked for 20 years in his career working to improve election administration. And prior to the EAC, he served as acting chief counsel for the U.S. Senate Committee on Rules and Administration. Next, we have Jeff Hale. Jeff leads the Election Security Initiative at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at DHS. And Jeff is a certified information security manager and has been supporting CISA since 2010. So we have Megan Wolf with us. She is the administrator of the Wisconsin Election Commission. And in that capacity, she serves as the state's chief election official. So we get some great insight from her into what it's been like on the ground recently. Lindsay Forsum is the director of cybersecurity programs for the National Association of Secretaries of State, where she manages the association's cybersecurity work with secretaries of states and their IT staff. And then lastly, we have Steve Gropin, who's the Senior Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at McAfee. He and his organization have been doing a lot of work on election security recently. Hopefully can provide us with a bit of an outsider's perspective on what he's seen and the strengths and weaknesses of the election that just occurred. So with that, I'm going to quickly kick over to our panelists. First, start off with our federal representatives to give kind of their take, and then move to the state folks, and then lastly, we'll hand things over to Steve to give that more critical outsider's perspective. I'm hoping we can start with Ben. You were one of the key signatories of the recent statement last week, which said that this election was the most secure one in American history, which I think is a really bold and remarkable statement. Can you give a little bit more context on sort of how you view the election, a little bit more detail there, and also reflect on what were the key factors that you think resulted in that secure election?
Thanks, Marshall. Great to be here. I'm glad I get to kick things off because I can brag about the state and local folks instead of them having to do it about themselves. But again, first and foremost, you can't give enough credit to the state and local election officials who did an amazing job running the election this year during this pandemic. Putting their own health at risk and particularly in so many states having to make pretty major changes to processes and procedures to adapt to where the voters were going to want to be. And of course, maintaining an eye on security throughout that. I think part of, you mentioned the statement from the other day, again, so much of that ties into the work that's been done. Unfortunately, most Americans don't get to see that firsthand, but for anyone that's been around the election space since, for the last several years, since 2016, what you've seen is a sea change in information sharing. It's really been awesome. Prior to the pandemic, every conference that you went to around elections was primarily dedicated to cybersecurity issues, to improving our systems, hardening those systems. I think that coupled with the $800 million that Congress had provided for election security, again, helped a lot of states replace outdated paperless equipment, implement things like audits, harden their statewide voter registration databases with things like multi-factor or replace those if it was needed, develop and implement things like cyber navigator programs where you have state-based staff members that recognize the decentralized nature of our elections. I'll let Megan talk about that because she more than anyone can really hit on what that looks like to have, is it 850 locals that you have in Wisconsin? Anyway, but again, when you look at it from the federal side, the critical infrastructure designation played a big role. Again, the state, local, and federal partnership. Again, I don't want to step on Jeff's toes too much here. He'll have a lot to hit on that, but partnership in the ISACs, again, having the Government Coordinating Council and the Sector Coordinating Council, having those governance bodies available or having regular conversations about the issues that arose this year. Again, all of those things, if they weren't in place, would made this year a lot harder. But first and foremost, you got to give credit to the state and locals for the way they stepped up and the work they did. And so, again, I'm glad that we're talking about, this election. I know that we've got some distraction about the real story here, but the real story is that state and locals did an amazing job, ran a great election. I know that this conversation goes on. There will be pieces that we hit about what's next, but again, an amazing job was done to make this year run as well as it did. And I think for me, one of the lessons looking forward is just simply that, we can't be content with that the reason that this year went so well was people put in the hard work, and we've got to build off of that and keep going.
Great, maybe Jeff, a good opportunity for you to jump in. Your organization, I think, does a lot of the technical engagement. So really interested to hear some of those pieces that you guys have worked on that you think sort of aided by either the operation or the technical security of our election system.
Thank you, Marshall. Pleasure to be here. I'd certainly echo what Commissioner Hovland said. One of the largest parts is the development of this robust community of practice around election security over the last 3.5 years. Megan can certainly speak to implementations at the state level, but from the federal perspective, we offer voluntary, no-cost services and things that help states to identify where their vulnerabilities are. We go into a little more depth and do penetration testing, risk and vulnerability assessments, and we have seen over time reduced time to patching, improved multi-factor authentication, better email security practices, better web security practices. Their IT security has improved, and while there's always still room for more, the gains here have been tremendous. But operationally, the other element is that really speaks to the improvement between 2016 and now that makes this the most secure election ever is the auditability. We're seeing more paper than ever that allows you to roll back the tapes and check that, verify that votes are cast as intended. And I think some project that more than 93 to 95% of votes cast should have an auditable paper record this year. So that's a tremendous gain.
Great. Megan, you were the recipient, hopefully, of some of that support at the federal level. Can you jump in and sort of let us know how that worked out? Give us your assessment of the support that you received and also what you're seeing on the ground.
Sure. So, I think elections in every state run so differently. And in the state of Wisconsin, we're certainly no exception. As Commissioner Hovland alluded to, we have 1,850 local election officials. So each city, town, and village has a local election official and runs elections. They might be the sole employee of their jurisdiction. They certainly don't have IT support or other things that they can rely upon to help them to secure elections. So we've really had to create a lot of programs specifically for those really small jurisdictions. And I think, a lot of the things that we have to do at the state level, they're customized for our tiny jurisdictions to make sure that they have what they need. But we receive a lot of support from CISA and from other organizations in helping us to protect the state infrastructure. Because even though we have 1,850 local election officials, we are still the custodians of the statewide voter registration database, of all of the voter data that makes elections happen. So whether or not it's registering voters and creating the poll books, issuing absentees, and making sure that only one ballot can ever be counted per voter, that is all really critical data. And so having resources available to us through CISA to help us analyze that technology, to help us identify or look for any vulnerabilities. We've even done assessments where we've been able to go back and look at our systems and make sure that all the footprints make sense. Make sure that somebody hasn't had access to our system and has something sitting there waiting to come to life on election day. And so it's really been a very fruitful partnership in the sense that it's allowed us access to a lot of resources that we probably couldn't have had access to as state government otherwise. And I think the fact that elections, was given the critical infrastructure designation really helped us again to have access to those resources. So we're able to work with those federal partners to really secure the infrastructure of that database. And then we work with the local election officials and can make sure that they have smaller scale programs in place on the local level. And we've also been able to do things like utilize the funding that's come to us from the EAC in terms of the HAVA security funds and the CARES grant funding to get resources to our local election officials. And we've done some pretty incredible things there. Just yesterday, I got an email from a clerk thanking us for both subgrants that we did, both with the security money as well as the CARES money, because they were able to get things like voting booths that they were able to clean easily to make sure that in-person voting was safe. And then they were also able to, with the security money, to get things like a computer. When we first started working with our local election officials to make sure they had what they needed to run elections, we found we had more than 1,000 of our 1,850 jurisdictions that didn't have basic things like access to IT resources or access to a secure computer. And we were able to use those funds to provide grants, and they may seem like very small grants to larger jurisdictions, but for smaller jurisdictions, $1,200 each meant that they were able to get a computer, meant that they were able to get IT resources. And I think by helping them with all of those basics and establishing that baseline and getting everybody to that baseline, it actually allowed us to keep pace with all the changes that were thrown at us this year. I think if we were still struggling to get everybody to that baseline, we would have been in real trouble. But I think because we had worked so hard the last few years to get everyone there, that we were able to build upon that really strong base and to change course very quickly to address new needs in light of the pandemic. Now, I think as we move forward, the real trick as we continue to all figure out how to work together is going to be sustainability. So that is kind of getting us here to where we are today. But what does the future look like? And what does the sustainability of these programs look like? Because these challenges aren't going to go away.
Great, thank you. We're definitely going to return to the sustainability. I think it's an excellent point that we want to flesh out a little bit more. But first, I want to sort of turn things over to Lindsay. I'll just say, like, one thing that I find remarkable thinking about the threat environment that my company faces, Mozilla, is the challenging environment we have and the capacity and the resources that we need to respond to that. And I somewhat marvel at the difficulty of sort of thinking about having that capacity in a mature security posture within sort of the diversity of state and local officials and election infrastructure that we have. Lindsay, can you jump in and comment about that capacity and how it's matured and sort of your viewpoint on that?
Certainly, thanks for having me. Just really quickly, I'm the Director of Cybersecurity Programs for the National Association of Secretaries of State. So at NAS, we represent secretaries of state throughout the country, and 40 of our members serve as their state's chief election official. So election administration and election security are major issues that the association is on. What I would say really has stood out to me since I've stepped back from the election a little bit is looking at how important all of the work was that we did leading up to the 2020 election in more ways than we could have ever imagined, because of course we didn't know that a global pandemic was coming. But given everything that had to happen in election administration around COVID, changing of processes, increased communication to voters, emergency actions, recruiting a whole fleet of new poll workers, all sorts of things, it was incredibly important that we already had the mechanisms in place for information sharing and focus on cybersecurity. So secretaries of state, for example, have built cybersecurity teams within their offices over the last 4 years. A lot of them have hired CIOs over the last 4 years. Several have hired CISOs or other cybersecurity engineers and built these teams in cyber navigator programs, as Commissioner Hovland mentioned, to assist local election officials with cybersecurity. So what's been so important about that is that as election directors within the offices had to really shift their focus for a little while to COVID, to responding to COVID, there were teams within the office that got to remain hyper-focused on election cybersecurity, and that was really important. Obviously, some things had to shift, like the cyber navigator programs, that people weren't able to travel to each local jurisdiction and sit down with folks like they had hoped. But, states adjusted, like with everything else, and shifted to a virtual environment to do many of those things and only traveled as necessary. But that's been so important. Having the EISAC, having the Election Infrastructure Subsector Government Coordinating Council in place for all this information sharing was more important than we ever could have even imagined that it would be. And even within NAS, some of the things we have done, like increasing the information sharing across the IT and cybersecurity staff within secretaries' offices has been huge. We've been able to leverage the existing relationships we had with that group of people and have monthly what we call tech talks leading up to the election and invite CISA to come on and talk about the threats and vulnerabilities they're seeing. And we had several of those in the week leading up to the election. So it's been so important to have all of these platforms and mechanisms in place. And I think we can all see that and see the importance of continuing to build on them, continuing to bring more than 8,000 local election officials across the country into the fold, into the information sharing fold, get them more involved, get them working with our partners like CISA. So, really the big takeaway right now is, wow, it was so important, all of this work that we did leading up to this point. And wow, we really need to continue to build on this in the years to come. We always have something new each election that we didn't quite expect. And so the more of a process we can have in place for addressing the challenges we know are going to be there, the better off we're going to be.
Great, thank you. And Steve, your organization has, you and your organization have just even this past summer, I highlighted some sort of cybersecurity hygiene issues with our current voting system. I'm wondering if you could jump in and talk about those a little bit and contextualize them in terms of what we saw over the past few weeks and the successful election and how you think about some of those ongoing hybrid.
Sure, you bet. I think one of the things that we're all seeing right now is that the confidence in the election process by the general public is as important as the security integrity of the election itself. It's one thing to have this panel have confidence in the election and the types of viewers that are watching this panel. It's another thing to give the American public the confidence that we have a fair, free, and non-tampered with environment. I think, Jeff's point that we've been able to move to greater than 90% of our voting practices to have a paper trail is really important because the general public is not a bunch of computer scientists, and they need to be able to look at a technology that everyone can understand. Clearly, paper does that. It's difficult to manipulate remotely from halfway around the world. It's difficult to change its scale, and it can be audited as many times as needed in order to get that confidence. So when I think about what's worked well this cycle, we've taken some really great strides in moving in that direction. I think in the area for improvement, it is some of the things that I've been talking a lot about and that McAfee's been very focused on, which is there are cyber hygiene things that are very basic, especially in the way that we're communicating information to the general public, that we have a ways to go. We still have the vast majority of local election sites not using .gov domain names. It's incredibly easy to set up a clone election website with false information, fake information about where, when, or how to vote. And while it doesn't appear that was actively exploited this cycle, we do need to be careful not to fall into the trap of, because something didn't happen this time, it implies it won't happen in the future. I think that's a very risky situation that we could get into. The other thing that I think is a challenge is around disinformation. I think even right now, lots of claims going on related to the integrity of the election that are blatantly false, while CISA has done an admirable job of tamping that down to a good degree. Clearly, there are lots of powerful social media and other communication vectors that are making disinformation challenging. And that's something we'll have to work towards as we look to future election cycles.
Great. Your comment about the hygiene does make me wonder. I mean, I think it demonstrates there are still clear vulnerabilities that sort of are there to be exploited by threat actors. It does, I think, raise this strategic question about the success that we just had, about to what extent does that reflect some awesome work on everyone's part? To what extent is the threat environment not quite as mature or scary as we might have worried it could be? Steve, do you have any thoughts on that, about the actual threat environment that we face and how it could continue to evolve?
Yeah, I think there's a few things I'd say. You know, one of the things we see all the time in cybersecurity is the reason we have cyber events is they're driven by incentives. So ransomware is rampant because it's a really good business model for cyber criminals. We see nation state activity when there are clear objectives by an adversary to achieve something. Generally, the areas of vulnerability aren't exploited unless there's something that an adversary wants to get in return. I think it's always a bit of a dangerous situation to get into the mode of, well, we didn't see a certain vector exploited in this cycle, therefore, let's assume that that's not going to be the one that will be focused on in the future. I don't know, and I'll be the first to admit that I don't know why some of these, what I would consider fairly easy vectors of manipulation, weren't exploited this go around. Clearly, we did see some disinformation coming out using fake domains, fake email, intimidation, potential looking to have blowback on certain countries. But why it wasn't more rampant is unclear. I do think getting the local infrastructure to use the very basics is a easy step forward. The fact that half of local election websites in 2020 don't use HTTPS, like that's horrifying. I mean, considering that everything else we do on the web is using secure web communications, it's a very basic step that at least gets us a place that citizens can look for a trusted set of information on the voting process.
Great, Jeff. I'm wondering if you have any comments on this. I think your organization sort of is on point for helping with some of not just these hygiene issues that Steve is talking about, but the sort of technical assessment and risk assessment piece is ideally, I think, intended to address the scope of sort of security hygiene problems. So I'm interested in sort of your thoughts on some of what Steve is highlighting. So earlier we heard from Representative Underwood about a high demand for your vulnerability assessment resources and a concern that you don't quite have the resources to cover the field. And so there's a whack-a-mole problem as you shift resources from one high demand area to another. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, on the resources you have for some of these high demand technical assessment pen testing.
Well, thank you. So this has been an area where we've learned a lot from election officials. Their demand and use for our programs. We started with risk and vulnerability assessments, which are resource intensive teams of 6 flying out on location to do an in-depth assessment. But the demand and for a more scalable service really drove us to develop remote penetration testing, which the community has embraced in full. And so it is these types of requirements levied upon us that help us get better at our job, not just in securing election infrastructure, but we do this for other critical infrastructure as well. So it's really taking lessons learned from how we can support this sector and seeing how we can mature as CISA. I agreed with most of what Steve was saying. I did want to point out that while the threat environment did look different, we did see the Iranian activity. They did obtain voter rolls. They did weaponize voter rolls by trying to contact voters. So part of this is that it's not to speculate as to why we didn't see more, but I do think that what was evidenced was a tighter knit community that does a better job of reporting incidents so that they can be addressed in near real time.
How much were you able to cover with the vulnerability assessment and pen testing, like in terms of the state demand for those? Do you feel like you were able to sort of meet the demand adequately?
So over the past few years, we've been able to cover the vast majority of state level infrastructure that as they want it. We've obviously been able, the talking point has been out there for a couple of years that we've put intrusion detection sensors on at the state level for every network. We've also been able to provide them at many of the large counties, particularly in bottom-up states. We've done risk and vulnerability assessments in more than half of the states with the state infrastructure. The remote penetration testing has been far more widely adopted at the local level. What we've also seen is it's not just what CISA provides. Many are using their Help America Vote Act funds or their CARES Act funding to turn to vendors and deploy cybersecurity vendors and really bring the control of that security in-house. It's been a tremendous improvement, and their willingness to share their lessons learned into this community means that it's not CISA dependent. It's everyone's adding value.
We've heard a few people mention the critical infrastructure designation for election infrastructure, and I think for those who are watching that don't know what that is, people might be interested to know what it is and why it matters. It might strike people as sort of a little administrative change, which I think is actually much more important than that. Would someone mind, Ben or Megan, I think you mentioned it as well, jumping in and just giving a little bit more context on why that is important and why it was a critical point of change?
I'm happy to start, and Megan, maybe if you want to fill in any gaps that I missed. So just a little background on that. So following the foreign interference that we saw in 2016 and January 2017, and Jeff, you should feel free to fill in any gaps here too. We saw DHS designate election infrastructure as critical infrastructure. And with that development, you saw a standing up of a governance structure. So we have a government coordinating council that is co-chaired by CISA and the AC, and we also have National Association of Secretaries of State, National Association of State Election Directors, and a local representative on the executive committee of that, and then a broader membership, again, of state, local, and federal partners. You also have a sector coordinating council, which is voting system manufacturers, some of the other private sector partners that work on, for example, primarily around mail voting, a lot of nonprofits that also support election administration at the state level. And so that structure, again, and the regular communication and coordination that we have, really, again, has helped facilitate that change in communication, or part of that we talked about. Again, the analogy gets overused of that you're exchanging business cards in the middle of a storm or whatever, but it really is that we're having these regular conversations. Again, looking back at the beginning of the pandemic, we had already had this group form that we were able to pull together a working group and compare notes and say, okay, what do we need to figure out? Who has capacity? For federal partners, we have the benefit of not having to run elections. And so we have some of the time and resources that we can maybe dedicate to supporting our state and local partners who are doing the hard work of running the elections. And so again, I think from that standpoint, it really created a governance and a communication structure that's been very valuable. We've also been able to produce a number of resources out of that, things like communications protocols. There's actually, because it's a pet issue for me, and as a preview going forward, I mean, things like we worked on a sector-specific plan. Lindsay was very key to that. But when we talk about resources, for example, there's a portion of that that says, when you really look at this sector and you're trying to assess risk, you can't fully assess that without talking about some of the resource issues, the fact that elections are chronically underfunded. And it says, while elections are primarily run at the state and local level and primarily funded at that level, there is a federal role. And I think, as we look forward, a piece of that is recognizing the importance of, what we hear consistently from state and local election officials is that need for a consistent, annual funding stream, something that can be used to maintain the level or the baseline that we've gotten to, improve that, keep moving forward, keep doing the basics, but also be able to plan around that. Things like these cyber navigator programs that I mentioned earlier, that's the type of thing where that's a staffing piece. You're not going to want to do that as a one-off with a contractor or or it only is good for so long. That's something you need to be planning for, looking forward. That's how we keep getting better. That's how we keep these systems as secure as possible. And so, again, I think the governance structure has helped have those conversations at the different levels of governance, but it's important to bring in our private sector partners, as they're very, they're part of this whole ecosystem of running our elections.
Great, Megan, anything you want to add to that? Or I know Lindsay has spoken on the some of these funding issues as well in the past, so we'd be interested in either of you jumping in.
Sure. I guess just briefly, I would echo that, in that I think, practically speaking, that the designation elevated the profile of elections as one of the pillars of our democracy, right? And so it allowed us access and a seat at the table to have these discussions with other critical infrastructure sectors, with other critical infrastructure partners. And it allowed us to coordinate in a way that I don't think we would have had access to if we didn't have that designation. So I really think that for the first time, it allowed elections a seat at the table in terms of discussing how, again, this critical pillar of our democracy, of our society, fits in to the other critical infrastructure sectors, and to sort of how we operate as a country, and making sure that we're taking into account the needs of elections and having discussions about how other things can impact how we're able to run our elections. And so I think it's still something that's growing. And I think we've come an incredibly long way since 2016 in building those relationships. But I think we're still continuing to grow those, to figure out how to best work together and partner together to leverage those resources. But it's been a really good, foundation, I think, that we've laid in terms of development of those relationships, and just the elevation of the profile of elections, and people understanding just how important it is that this is something we pay attention to and that we resource.
Marshall, might I jump in?
Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
First, thank you for all the kind words about the critical infrastructure designation. I know that 4 years ago, we didn't necessarily roll it out in the best way. I think this is a testament to the ability to really try and add value to the community, and do our best to demonstrate benefit here. But the benefit goes both ways. We at CISA have needed this type of forum to learn from election officials. It has changed our ability to notify victims, for once. It's now we've changed our victim notification policy so that when an incident occurs at the local level, we ensure that Lindsay's members, that people at Megan's level are aware of the incident, because they're responsible for certifying the election in their state. And so they are an important constituent of that information. And frankly, oftentimes they're the first line of defense in being able to respond to these incidents. So we've learned a lot. We've been able to evolve our posture and really understand the requirements of the sector better because of this type of designation. Sorry, Lindsay.
No problem. I was just going to jump in on the broader resourcing question, which obviously is a challenge and will continue to be a challenge. You've seen election officials at the state and local level over the past 4 years pushing for more resourcing at their level. A lot of secretaries have worked with their state legislatures to secure more resources. And that's a really important part of this, with elections being run at the state and local level. NAS, our members support stable federal funding to help supplement that state funding. As Commissioner Hovland mentioned, that stable part is an important part of it. It's a challenge to get that from Congress, we recognize, but being able to plan around when funding is going to come is really important, with things like the Cyber Navigator programs, staffing, CISOs, ongoing relationships with vendors, all of those sorts of things. The planning is incredibly important. My members regularly say that election cybersecurity is a race without a finish line. It's something we know we're going to be focused on for years to come. We know there are vulnerabilities that still need to be addressed, particularly at the local level, and there always will be. We'll always be looking toward the next thing and the next threat, the next risk. And so resourcing is going to continue to be a focus. I think a really important thing, we know we're never going to have it. Not every election office across this country is ever going to have as much money as they feel they need to address election security. So it's also really important to look at what states and localities are doing to leverage partnerships and leverage the resources that are available to them. Our members, for example, also support the ongoing funding of services from CISA that help them fill in gaps and assess and manage risk. Additionally, Secretary of State's offices regularly utilize resources, create partnerships with other state agencies in their state so that they can leverage each other's resources. For example, states have partnered with their state CIO's office to provide support and training to local election officials and also to local IT departments and counties. And they've created agreements and partnerships with National Guard units so that National Guard can help them assess risk or help with cyber incident surge support. So that's another really important part of all the information sharing that's happening is states can share these promising practices with each other. And as they're implementing these things, they don't all have to learn the lessons the hard way. They can hear from each other what lessons they learned. But yes, we need more funding. Yes, we need stable funding, but we're also going to have to continue to leverage the resources that are out there and partner with each other to make the best use of them.
Thanks. We have a question in the Q&A from Eric Geller about the CISA leadership. Obviously, this has been in the news recently. The way that I think I want to use this to ask a question overall about the muscle that has been built within all of these organizations and how quickly it can atrophy. So if we see leadership changes from the top of some of these critical organizations, what do we lose? What is the risk here? If we see leadership changes or other shifts in focus, and how much muscle have we built in this community that we've been talking about that is durable and not at risk?
I'm happy to start there. I mean, I'll say, look, we've absolutely come a long way, and again, you have to give tons of credit to the state and locals for putting in the work. I think the federal government has approached this maybe better than in the past. Certainly Jeff had the dual experience, as he acknowledged earlier, of the pains. I used to work at the Missouri Secretary of State's office, and then I worked at the Senate Rules Committee. And I think one of the things that's important for the federal government, anytime the federal government's playing a role in elections or engaging in elections, I think part of what's worked so well in the last couple of years with the maturing of the critical infrastructure designation is recognizing how change works in the election space, recognizing the decentralized nature of that and working with it. Part of that is recognizing that each state, because it runs its elections in its own unique way, has unique challenges. And so it's part of that is being a resource when you can be, meeting states where they are, recognizing that those challenges are not blanket across the country. And I think that's been an important part of it. Certainly I think as we look to continue moving forward, that's a big piece of the puzzle as well. If you're not taking that approach, if you're not taking a good governance, customer service approach to making a difference, it's going to be a lot harder.
Great. I'm wondering, we've been talking a lot about some positive changes that we've made over the last few years. I'm interested in people jumping in and talking about some of the things that we might not have gotten right. There's been a lot of changes, a lot of things have been tried, and I think we heard from Jeff sort of alluded to a few things that might not quite have gotten started on the right foot. Is there anything this group would highlight of things which maybe actually we tried to get done and didn't, or initiatives which might have been false starts or headed in the wrong direction. Like I said, useful inflection point to reflect on some of the things that didn't work or might not have been the best ideas, in addition to all the great work that did occur.
Yeah, I guess I'll throw one thing in, which is I don't think we got over the finish line to have a paper trail everywhere, given that election process is largely delegated to state and local authorities. We still do see some areas that there is not a paper capability. And I think the big issue is, even if you have technology that passes a level of confidence for cybersecurity experts as being secure, it's going to be very difficult to have the general public transitively trust the opinions of others. And I think for the next election cycle, having 100% paper audit trail, even if we're using automation for scanning, tallying, as long as you have the ability to do a manual recount, I think what's happening in Georgia right now is very positive in that it shows the power of, if the time ever comes that you need to pull out the actual ballots and see what was written on them, you have the ability to do that with a technology that every human being can understand. So I think that's one of the things I'd love to see additional progress made for the next cycle.
You know, one of the things I would add to that is, I can't even imagine being a local election official this year. It had to have been, it was just, they overcame the impossible time and time and time and time again. We were faced with things where we thought, this is just not going to be possible. We can't do this. How do you run an election in a pandemic while you're already dealing with all these things, facing all the public scrutiny? But they found a way, and they were incredibly resourceful and resilient. I think one of the things, though, is that how do you communicate this effectively? And that feeds into Steve's point, is that if people don't engage in going in their local communities and observing the election process, because every single step of the election process is publicly observable and it's transparent, from being able to buy the voter lists and see who's on the list, who's been issued an absentee ballot, to observing the pre-election voting equipment tests, to election day itself, where you can watch people vote. There's a challenge process. You can even watch the absentee ballots be processed. The canvass process, where at the municipal level, at the county level, and at the state level, they double check their elections and they certify their results. All of that is publicly observable, where you can literally see every ballot being issued, being counted, and being double checked. But if people don't know about those opportunities to engage, or they don't know how to engage, or they don't know what they're looking at, then you can run the best election that's ever been run, which I would also agree we just did. But if people don't see that and don't engage with those facts, they really don't count to folks. And so I think, one thing we need to figure out how to do better, and every day I wake up and I challenge myself to try to find a way, is how do we communicate the facts and the mechanics about how our elections work to the public in a way that's meaningful, in a way that's approachable, in a way that they can engage with it. And I think that's still something that we need to figure out, is how do we bring those facts to people, and how do we get them to engage with those facts?
I've got to chime in here as well. I certainly appreciate it. I think that's exactly right. One of the things that I thought worked really well this year, the National Association of Secretaries of State drove a campaign starting last fall, Trusted Info 2020, really talking about how people need to get their election administration info from their state and local election officials, and raising awareness about that. I think that was a big deal, but I think the reality is, there are so many benefits that we get from our decentralized elections. Again, thinking about the pandemic, the fact that we had election administrators from Washington and Oregon and Colorado and Utah who were able to lend their expertise of having ramped up mail and absentee ballots, made that transition and share those lessons learned and pitfalls with their colleagues across the country. That mattered this year. But similarly, mis and disinformation in this space is very difficult to combat because you don't necessarily have those centralized structures. The Election Assistance Commission was created to be a federal clearinghouse for voting information. I think, somewhat self-interestedly here, that that's a no-brainer to be able to consolidate a lot of that information, trusted source information in one place. But again, there's a resourcing issue. Our budget last year was $11 million. That was up from 7.95 the year before, which was an all-time low. We're way lower than we were a decade ago, pre-critical infrastructure, pre-foreign interference, pre-COVID. I mean, so many of these things around elections, there are economies of scale, things that you can do, thinking about disaster recovery and contingency planning, coup planning. We had started to stand up a working group around that in 2019 and then got our lowest budget in history. And so there's an element of this that's there, that the game plan is there. You can figure these things out, but it does take investment to do it. And I certainly think our democracy is worth it. I hope that others do.
Thanks, Commissioner Hovland. I'm just going to chime in really quickly as well. Our Trusted Info 2020 initiative is another thing that when we launched it, knowing the importance of accurate election information, we still didn't quite realize how important it would be. This year, with polling locations and some rules and processes changing at the last minute or much later in the process than they usually do, it was even more important than usual to point voters to their election officials for election information. And I encourage voters, or if you're talking to voters or the general public, please encourage them to continue to look to their local, state and local election officials throughout the end of this process as well. As Megan discussed, there's a lot of opportunities for understanding how the process works, understanding things are still happening, right? Results are still being verified and double checked and certified. And so look to your state and local election officials to understand how that is all happening. To the original question, there were two quick things I just wanted to chime in on. Two areas of focus I've seen from the state secretaries of state and their IT staffs over the past few years has been one, as we've mentioned several times, outreach to local election officials, bringing more of those 8,000 plus local election officials into the EII SAC, for example, getting more of them risk and vulnerability assessments, working with them on just simple training and risk assessment. And that's an area where there's been a lot of success in launching Cyber Navigator programs. Some states have also learned, difficulties in implementing these programs, especially with limited funding, where they've maybe tried to do it with one Cyber Navigator program, for example, and had to adjust and learn from each other. But that's an area where I think we need continued growth, and I think most folks in the field would agree. There are other states that I know are looking at launching Cyber Navigator programs over the next 2 years. We've seen a lot over the past 2 years, and I think we're going to continue to see that. The other is taking advantage of research that's available through the independent security research community. We've seen an increased appetite for that from election officials, a lot of discussion over coordinated vulnerability disclosure programs or partnering for pen testing from the private sector and those sorts of things. Again, another area where we've seen some growth. We saw 2 Secretary of State offices launch coordinated vulnerability disclosure programs this year, even in the midst of the pandemic and everything that was changing there. But I think that's another area where election officials and the InfoSec community want to see continued growth.
Awesome. We've got 4 more minutes. I think we want to end on time to hand things back over to Ari. Maybe I'm hoping everybody can just chime in with like final thoughts from the panel, and also leave us with kind of that one thing that you are hoping like that we move forward with that we weren't able to get done over the last 4 years, and that we really need to concentrate on and make a priority moving forward, to leave the group with some final thoughts. Steve.
So I'm happy to start. I think I'd say let's take advantage of the off years to make progress. I think thinking about election security only in 2022, 2024, it's too late. I think we have a real opportunity in 2021 to focus on the areas that we still have room for improvement.
Yeah, I think that's, from my perspective as a state election official, I think that's true too. There are no off years in elections as well. I think that's an important point too. We're always dealing with elections. For example, this December, we're going to start processing nomination papers for our yearly February statewide election and then our yearly April statewide election. And so elections don't just happen every 4 years. And it doesn't matter if it's a low turnout election or if it's a presidential election, your local election official still has to make the same preparations as if everybody is going to show up and to continue to secure our systems. And so I think also recognizing that while it is somewhat cyclical in nature, the elections are ongoing all the time, and it's something that really needs to be sustained as part of the sort of normal everyday fabric of our government.
I'm happy to chime in. First, I'd like to express my appreciation for people like Megan, who have not only ran a tremendous election, but also elevated the profile of election officials and really become security executives. I've seen her speaking and communicating at the national level. And I think this is really a testament to the work that election officials have put in. The area I would like to continue to see CISA grow in is deepening our support to local election officials. We've made good inroads over the last 3.5 years, but the threat environment is still going to remain. And so we have to help them, along with our federal partners, reach levels of security for 2022 and 2024 and beyond.
I'll chime in quickly. It's funny to hear Steve mention the work that needs to happen during the off years. I actually feel like that is when we're hyper focused on election security is the off years. It's when the Government Coordinating Council updated our sector specific plan. It's when we do a lot of the planning, right? And then when we're in crunch time around a midterm and a general election, there's just implementation and just information sharing more so. But yeah, I look forward to turning back to some of that work, going back to that sector specific plan and being able to evaluate what have we gotten accomplished so far? What do we still need to get accomplished and how do we get there? So the work's definitely never ending and we will continue.
I cheated a little bit and looked at the Q&A, and so there's actually one there I kind of wanted to hit anyway. I think as we look at this, again, there was, so much credit due to the work that went into this year. There's so many lessons learned to come out of this year. I think a lot of what we'll be doing is digesting that, looking for what worked and what didn't and ways to implement that. But a big piece of it too is looking at that, continued training, how you expand opportunities and reach people, help bring up the baseline even more. Lindsay and I work on a training working group that's within the critical infrastructure subsector. Again, there's a lot of good things that have been highlighted out of that. But again, not to sound like a broken record, there are tie-ins here on resources. Some of that is things that, hopefully we can provide or CISA can provide. There are the pieces of just the grant money that we give out investing in our elections. Again, the federal government's never going to put more in than the state and locals do, but there's a value in supplementing that, recognizing that this is a national security challenge and investing in it appropriately. So hopefully that will happen. I know we'll all continue to do that work, but it's important to have the resources to do it.
Awesome. Well, one more thank you for participating today and all the insights that you brought to the discussion, and also for all of the work that you have done and the work that we're all gonna continue to have to do going forward to continue to ensure our success. And with that, we'll hand things back over to Ari.
Yeah, thanks so much, panel. I can't say how much that was inspiring to me, because so many of these topics, when we do these panels, it seems like it's such a slow slog. And on this one, looking back 4 years, we've made a lot of progress in this space, and you guys really deserve a lot of credit for that. And I'm glad that so much could come out in this panel on that. And we really, the discussion has advanced so much. Still a lot to do, but on our way to getting there, and it was really great to hear that. It's my pleasure now to introduce Ann Neuberger. Ann is the NSA's Director of Cybersecurity. She has served at NSA for 11 years and has had several jobs there, including as Deputy Director of NSA's operations, where she led cybersecurity operations. And she was also the agency's first Chief Risk Officer. One thing that I think sets Ann apart is that she has an MBA. I mean, she can speak to business, she can speak to government and speak policy at the same time. And I think now in this new role as Director of Cybersecurity, her desire to do outreach more to companies really puts her in a unique, with that background, puts her in a unique ability to go out and have real conversations with people and move cybersecurity issues forward. In my time, I'll say that I worked with Ann for the 6 years that I was in government, and you're not going to find a more dedicated public servant to the mission that she has. And I was always really impressed with that, and I feel lucky to have her serving in this role as a taxpayer. And I appreciate her time coming today. So I'm going to hand it off to Ann, and can't wait to hear what she has to say.
Ari, thank you so much for that introduction. It's great to see you. It's great to see so many others. Really appreciated. That's a particularly high mark, return on investment for your taxpayer money. Okay, that will inspire me every morning. So thank you for that. So in talking with Ari and with Grant about this talk, they asked me to talk a bit about the work of the cybersecurity mission, our top threats that we see, what our focus areas are, and then I had some questions for you at the end. I know you'll have some questions for me as well. So first, the decision to stand up the cybersecurity directorate, NSA had long had two missions, a foreign intelligence and a cybersecurity mission, but the decision to really invest in our cybersecurity mission stemmed from a sense that our nation was at a significant crossroads with our national security, as there were enormous technological and societal shifts that were converging, and the world that we inhabited was evolving quickly. China has now become a peer, a powerful economy, a growing military, and really a leader in technology, and increasingly willing to intimidate with a more aggressive risk calculus. So we work to, in our cybersecurity mission, integrate intelligence, our focus on understanding nation-state actors, their capabilities, their infrastructure, how they seek to integrate cyber within their national objectives, with practical advice on how to counter their tactic, techniques, and procedures. So essentially, we seek to know what our adversaries are doing and to provide that integrated, unclassified advice on how to counter their specific efforts. Our overall mission is to prevent and eradicate threats to the nation's most sensitive networks, with a focus really on the defense industrial base and to work through that. So we recognize that our threat intelligence, though, can be used by network defenders broadly. So we seek to share that advice at an unclassified level to the fullest extent possible, so in a way that's actionable and in a way the public can trust. So I want to talk a bit about the current threats that we're seeing, what we're working to do to address them, and where we see some gaps. So first, near-peer adversaries. China and Russia are well known for using cyber operations as a significant asymmetric force multiplier, and they've historically been emboldened to do so with really minimal consequences. So the speed at which they can convert vulnerabilities to exploit, take a publicly known vulnerability that's just come out and actually use it to weaponize it and gain access to a network they target, can be as little as 48 hours. So with many organizations that we see having testing processes to test a patch of multiple days, that window from when China or Russia can weaponize a new vulnerability before a company or an organization can patch is very significant. China is notable for the scope and scale of their operations. They've used a staggering degree of intellectual property theft to build their economy and military and really build their global ambitions. Russia, in contrast, has waged a disinformation war, often using US technologies and US infrastructure to sow and amplify divisions in our society, in Western societies, with the ultimate goal of eroding trust in democratic institutions. Of note, Russia and China both use technologies that are meant to connect us, to exert more authoritarian control over their own populations, and in many cases work to extend that influence to ours. Moving on, Iran is also a volatile threat. You've seen this recently in the news. Iran has joined Russia in seeking to interfere in our elections. They've also demonstrated their ability and willingness to launch disruptive cyber attacks within their own region, including by public reports, control systems, which is troubling in terms of crossing lines on potential harm to civilians. Ransomware is also a significant threat that we're tracking. With the rise of anonymous currencies, we've seen criminal actors really shifting from stealing credentials for their traditional rob a bank approach to the more lucrative ransomware activity. It became a key priority for us as our government partners at CISA and the FBI flagged it during COVID for expansive targeting of institutions, of hospitals. Government, industry, and our allies alike have all reached the same conclusion that ransomware was a key concern and couldn't be tolerated. I'll talk a little bit more about that with regard to some of the related activities a bit later. So we recognize that as those threats had evolved, as they were becoming greater in scope and scale and rapidity, we needed to evolve and change as well. So we've made some significant operational and cultural changes to drive impact that we hope scales across the cybersecurity community. First, going beyond information sharing. Second, rapid threat tipping, particularly with a focus on the defense industrial base. We're a combat support agency. Third, going all in on our partnerships. And fourth, kicking off a major encryption effort across DoD and the nation's most sensitive networks. So first, going beyond information sharing. We work to shift. Mission success for us is not victim notification, is not notifying a particular organization you've been compromised. Because once they're a victim, the damage is done. We're not going to be recovering those advanced fighter jet engineering plans or a company's millions of dollars of R&D. Once they've become a victim, once the theft has already occurred. So we've shifted our measure of success to preventing and eradicating the threat before the attack or exploitation successfully occurs. You've seen this embodied in the cybersecurity guidance we've shared publicly. In our first year, 26 unclassified products available on our website or on our Twitter account. And we focused on sharing unique, actionable, and timely information because information is only as good as the action it compels. So we had two goals for these public releases. First, enabling network defenders to secure their systems against current threats. An example of those products were the product we released on a significant cryptographic vulnerability in Windows 10, or the one we did recently where we noted the 25 CVEs that Chinese nation-state actors are currently actively exploiting. Because we heard loud and clear from the network defender community that there's more alerts, there's more vulnerabilities than they have time to address. So we said, look, the vulnerabilities that nation-state entities are currently exploiting should be at the top of the list. And by working to bring that information together, the intelligence information, the CVE information, to say, here's how network defenders should prioritize their activities, we work to really enable them to achieve the greatest impact. The second goal of our advisories is raising cost on adversaries by publicly exposing their capabilities, tactics, and procedures. And I'll note a couple of advisories in that. One you may have seen about Exim, a mail agent that we saw the Russian intelligence service, the GRU, actively exploiting. And as then, we raised awareness about that and then also provided advice on how to secure, how to patch against that. And then the Drovo Rub advisory that highlighted a specially built Linux malware capability with advice again on how to find it and counter it. That one we made a priority because typically we see nation-state actors using tools that they need to achieve an objective. So if a routine CVE will work and be good enough, they'll use that. But when we see them building specially purpose-built malware that takes a lot of time and attention, that's typically for a higher value target. So we had a lot of concerns that it might be used for the election, and as part of that work to expose that malware to enable the cybersecurity community to build defenses against it. So those are really the examples of those 26 advisories that we felt are at the crux of that culture change of getting out unique, timely, and actionable information that integrates intelligence information with practical advice on how to counter it. Second, the DIB. Our adversaries have consistently infiltrated the defense industrial base for years to steal valuable intellectual property and other sensitive defense information. So in response, we've worked with the CIO of the Department of Defense to enhance direct information sharing with DIB companies and their service providers to get left of that theft. Feedback from the community has been overwhelmingly positive to date, and we continue to expand upon those initial efforts as a combat support agency. Protecting that defense information really resonated deeply. Third, really investing in partnerships and thinking about how we contribute to our partners' success. And I'll highlight two recent efforts that were at the crux of that. Our work on elections, building on the last discussion, which I really enjoyed listening to the tail end of it, and our work on ransomware. Regarding elections, I tip my hat to our close partners at CISA and the FBI for their hard work. We worked incredibly hard to support their efforts to secure the recent elections. Our focus was on tracking foreign threats and rapidly clearing information to be shared with states, local governments, and the private sector. We did some of the best partnership work I've observed us do. For example, we shared with our government partners 3,000 indicators of compromise, 200 notifications of victims, 225 more detailed information on specific inquiries related to intelligence reports, and more than 20 leads and tips to our partners at CISA and the FBI to enable security of democratic processes. And of course, they provided tips back that we used to then pursue and identify other activity. With some of the really best partnership efforts where each of us brought our unique game to protecting the most valuable asset we have as a democracy, our democratic processes. A second example of that focus on partnerships was our work on ransomware. We've taken a more proactive approach to partnering with government agencies and other partners to identify ways to make ransomware operations more difficult for our adversaries, less scalable, and less lucrative. So while responsibility for counter-ransomware operations may not always be claimed by those involved, we expect the tempo and intensity of these operations to occur because we want to raise the cost of those operations against the US. Our final effort that I noted as a current priority is modernizing cryptography for the nation's most sensitive networks to counter a world where the telecommunications environment is increasingly untrusted. So those are our really high priority efforts at this moment in time. Let's talk a moment about gaps. First, while certainly a great deal of progress has been made, we recognize that gaps remain, and there are some significant challenges for all of us as a community to overcome. So as I had a chance to look at the background of the participants here, I thought I'd start with one that we hear frequently from organizations, the challenge of enterprise risk management for cybersecurity. We've heard organizations say again and again, millions of dollars are invested in cybersecurity, yet many organizations struggle to communicate the effectiveness of their cybersecurity technology, how it impacts adversarial activity, and where their next investment should occur. They struggle with the question of how do you set a risk appetite? How do you measure investment in new capabilities against that? So during my time as the agency's chief risk officer, we looked at those kinds of hard questions by asking really three kinds of questions. First, what were our high value assets? Did we understand what they were, whether they're on our networks, whether they're on contractor networks to us? And how do we make sure that we can protect those? Second, our reputation is one of our highest value assets. How do we ensure we understand risks to that and ensure that we protect them? And then how do we understand and measure risk holistically across the individual silos of infrastructure, technology, operations, partnerships, so that individuals who may have worked in one area and have significant depth in that area have the opportunity to sit around a table and discuss risks, enterprise risks, learn from others, and learn how their work impacts another area, which is frequently where we may have not fully understood holistic risk in the past. So to get at this problem, we built a model called DODCAR, the DoD Cybersecurity Analysis and Review, which is an analytical model that measures return on investment on cybersecurity investments across the areas of protect, detect, and respond. Essentially, it looks across the steps of the kill chain and aligns different types of cybersecurity capabilities against that in a given architecture, customized for that architecture, to allow an organization to say, where might we have gaps across that, across visibility, across opportunity to respond, and where might we have duplicates that we can harvest investment from? I'm happy to talk more about that. Second, as a gap, the combined effects of disinformation and cyber, hack and leak activities at inopportune times, or a mixture of potentially real and false data accelerated by the reach of social media. We all recall the quote, "A lie can travel around the world faster than truth can get its pants on." For countries or organizations, a hacked Twitter account, as we've seen recently, is a key issue. And artificial intelligence can make false images or data added to this mix an even greater concern. And finally, two more finallys actually. First, speed and agility in cyber matters. And getting a rapid picture across foreign threats to critical infrastructure and critical domestic systems is often challenging. We've made great stride in this area in partnering across the US government, leveraging each of our unique authorities and capabilities to serve as force multipliers for each other. And you've likely seen some of the joint products we've done with CISA and the FBI to get at exactly those kind of topics. And these are deeply, deeply valued partnerships for us. This is especially true for the cybersecurity of national security systems, the sensitive systems which carry national security information, classified information. So we're putting a lot of work into improving threat and mitigation among operators of those critical systems. And finally, trust. Public-private partnership is critical, and we can't expect the public or private industry to trust a black box. So we're working to build trust with the cybersecurity community, showing more of our hand by, for example, accepting attribution when we share a vulnerability so that companies and organizations can see the work that we're doing in that space. And we've done a couple of those in the last couple of weeks. Forums like this one are also an extremely valuable way in building public-private partnerships and building trust amongst all of that. So with that, I'd like to leave some time for questions, and I also have some questions for you, but following those that you may have for me. Thanks again for your time today, and thanks so much, Ari, for the invitation.
Sure. Thanks, Ann. Thanks for doing this. Thanks again. So people can ask questions in the Q&A. I know I'll tee up one to get things started here, which is on the relationship with DHS. You talked a little bit about it, and you also talked about the your new move to have attribution when you put out a vulnerability. Can you talk a little bit about where CISA's role ends in terms of vulnerability disclosure and the work that they do in sharing of that kind of information, and where you think NSA's begins, and how you coordinate that with those vulnerability sharing with them?
Absolutely, sure. So first, typically the process has worked where we identify a vulnerability in our operations, as you well know, Ari, that goes through the vet process at the White House. And then we typically work, whichever entity identified the vulnerability works to share it quietly with the company so that the company can work to see, do they have an exploit to currently exploit that? Those are usually the priority vulnerabilities to address, and to accelerate delivery of a patch in order to do that. So we typically will provide technical experts. I think of, again, like the Windows 10 cryptographic vulnerability. We had our cryptographic experts working closely to identify how that vulnerability would present, look to see in foreign intelligence if we saw an adversary exploiting that, to help assist the company in determining how rapidly do they need to accelerate a patch to that. We worked closely in that case, for example, with CISA, to set up advanced discussions to tip government CISOs to make sure they were aware of it, and to ensure CISA was positioned to then have discussions across critical infrastructure with companies they brought together to tell them, this is a vulnerability that matters, this is significant, we encourage you to patch. So that's how the partnership typically works in that particular area.
Thanks. Well, here's a question from Steve Crocker, who asked what the NSA is doing with respect to identifying and countering threats to the internet's basic infrastructure, particularly routing and DNS.
Really good question. So we're focused on foreign threats to that, identifying foreign capabilities and attempts to route that. Clearly, this is an area where we've seen public information around concerns regarding BGP, and around there's great awareness around some of the current vulnerabilities in the way the internet infrastructure is. It was stood up for massive communications and for reducing latency, not necessarily for security. So we quietly work with providers to encourage the more secure protocols, to work in standards bodies to encourage more secure protocols, and where we have threat information about nation state actors to ensure we can share that information so entities who are making decisions about implementing security practices can say, okay, this is a more near-term issue, as a practical threat, let's accelerate implementation of those security practices.
I know that many of the members of the Cybersecurity Coalition are also members of the Enduring Security Framework, and there's some question about the future of that organization and what it should be. And I don't know how much we want to go into detail about the history of it, et cetera, but just I was wondering if you could address that issue for the people that are sort of in both worlds. So.
Absolutely. And we've clearly been discussing this with CISA quite a bit. I'll share my perspective, which is informed by seeing ESF do really terrific work, seeing it in the past. My perspective is what makes ESF really unique and where it's done the most impactful work is where there's specific threat information, where the ability to truly address it requires a group of companies across the stack, chip companies, operating system companies, software companies, working together to ensure that the threat is truly addressed, and where government can serve as a facilitator and as receiving information, anonymizing it, and then spreading it in a small group. So for example, I highlight, of course, many of us recall the work ESF did in BIOS just about a little bit less than 10 years ago. And what made that partnership work was there was a practical focused threat. It required partnership across the types of companies I noted, and companies were not comfortable sharing with their competitors details about what percentage of their product lines were at risk or were vulnerable. So the government was able to serve a useful forum, not only in bringing technical experts to bear in a really kind of narrow space across NIST, NSA, DHS at the time, but also to say, okay, we'll gather that you'll share with us the information about what percentage of your product lines are vulnerable. And we'll say overall, across the industry, 80% are vulnerable. And then we can work with each entity to help essentially help them put that in place. And then most importantly, in some cases, use the power of government procurement to say, we will purchase as a DoD, as the broader US government, we will purchase products that meet the standards as documented in a particular government standard. In this case, it was a NIST special publication. So we accelerate the market by priming the pump to say, we value this security. So I think those three attributes coming together, a particular threat and area of focus that requires a set of partnership across companies and where we can also, as government, bring some unique value. Operational efforts is where we see ESF brings value. And I know in talking with both my counterpart, Chris Krebs at CISA, we're both committed to drive ESF to those kind of operational efforts. You see that now, there's one current effort. We necked it down, one current operational effort, participants only who bring game to that particular 5G effort, because 5G is a perfect example of that kind of a threat and the kind of promise of what public-private partnership can do in this space.
Well, we do have more questions, but the time is we're at the end of the time. Can you take a couple more, or do you need to get going to the next meeting?
I really appreciate the questions. I will take, if there are, I'll take a couple more, and then I'd like folks to think about my question, which then maybe, Ari, if there's a way to get that back to me, that would be great.
Yeah. Okay, sure. Well, here's one from, which is on routing and DNS. Does that mean we can expect procurement criteria around ISPs? Is that what you mean by when you're talking about routing and your answer on routing and DNS? That's not necessarily the way I took it, but I don't know.
That's not necessarily, but I do think that's not necessarily the way what I had in mind. But I do think the point is well taken, that we can and we should be using the power of government procurement to certainly accelerate adoption of security standards, and that's certainly something we're tracking, particularly in the Department of Defense and the IC. Mm-hmm.
And then David Hoffman asks about your relationship with the Civil Liberties and Privacy Office and how that oversight works and how you're collaborating with them.
Got it. Hi, David. Good to hear from you. So the Civil Liberties and Privacy Office in NSA is one of our strongest important partners. NSA has made a big push on increasing transparency following, in the last number of years. And certainly having a voice who came from the privacy community, who's in the decisions, who's fully cleared and is a part of the decisions, as part of those risk framework decisions I mentioned earlier, ensures that privacy and civil liberties has a seat at the table in all of our operations. So really strong partnership there.
Great.
So do I get to ask a question?
Yes, now we'd like to ask your questions and we'll end there. Yeah, that's great.
Right. And really my question is feedback from the community on the products we've issued in our first year. Are they helpful? Feedback on what is most useful in terms of, again, working to share threat information in a timely, unique, and actionable way. We would really welcome that feedback as we look to frame our next year's work, our next year's partnerships.
Well, I know the Cybersecurity Coalition and probably Cyber Threat Alliance too would be happy to meet with you on that point actually separately. So I will ask for request a meeting down the road once perhaps at the beginning of the new year on that. We can look back on the year of 2020 on that. But for those that are not members, I put it in the chat and we will forward it on to Anne the answers in the chat on that question because it's a great question. I think we want to help you do better and I do think that I've only heard good things about the way things have been going, but obviously you can always make them better. So it's good to get that feedback. We really thank you for your time and your willingness to do this. Obviously, NSA is not known for its outreach until now, so we appreciate that this kind of new NSA and the role you're playing and make it happen. So we hope we can continue working with you.
Thank you so much, Audrey. Take care and be well, everyone.
Yeah. I'm going to just remind people about tomorrow. So tomorrow we're starting at 11 o'clock again. And Michael Daniel will give the welcome then. And then we will have Member of European Parliament, Collierand, Marina Collierand, give a keynote. And then Michael's will do his panel on combating cybercrime. And then we will pretty much have like just enough time for people to get food and bring it back in front of their computer or carry their computer into the kitchen for the lunchtime keynote with Chris Krebs. And that will go from 12:30 to 1 o'clock. And then we will have a Cyber Luminaries panel with some of the leading voices in cybersecurity on a range of different issues. And closing with Alex Stamos, who is always speaking of cyber luminaries, one of the big cyber luminaries out there, and always has interesting things to say. So we hope you will be joining us tomorrow. It should be a great day. Thanks everyone for today. We really appreciate everyone's participation. Been a very active audience, and we can't wait to do it again tomorrow. Bye.